This video was supposed to be an interview with Dr. Stephen Hazen. We requested an interview with him because he bills himself as the world expert on cults and mind control and how to dismantle cults. I came across him on this TEDx video where he is being interviewed about QAnon, and it's very, very instructive because really what we're trying to do with the Extinctionati is an alternate reality game slash cult, and I thought he would be more interested in our project. We told him that this is an experiment. We're actually creating a cult, so I thought he'd be very interested to hear about this. As it happened, we did a bit of back and forth, and it now looks like he probably won't be participating in an interview. But I thought I'd like to go ahead and critique the TEDx video because it would explain so much about what we're doing in the Extinctionati, and it would explain so much about QAnon and cults in general, which is something I think people have really found it difficult to understand. I think the first thing is most people think that cults are destructive and terminal and dark things, and I think they are right. So you might ask, well, why would you want to create one? Well, my thinking on this is that my definition of a cult is that it's really a collective of ideas. Any group of people that get together based on an ideology or a collection of ideas and use those ideas to pursue a goal is actually in a cult.
Many tests were devised and measures were devised to try to find those traits that would help us predict who was vulnerable, seduced by or influenced by a cult. And those efforts all ended in failure. The conclusion one could draw from that is that we're all potentially vulnerable to cults.
Now, why does that turn destructive? Well, I believe that at the heart of the goal seeking is ultimately there's always this motive that really Ernest Becker was talking about, and it's really an imperative to immortality. What happens in the pursuit of immortality and these kind of immortality projects that we have all over the world, from countries to clubs, to corporations, to military organizations, to religions, what they all are is an effort for us to try and preserve ourselves. It's what Ernest Becker calls immortality projects. And in the pursuit of this immortality, there's this kind of enantiodromia, there's this something inherent in them where they become their opposite. Instead of actually achieving immortality, what happens is they achieve destruction, self-destruction. It's what Heraclitus said, that everything becomes its opposite in the end. So if you try and do an immortality project, it will be your destruction, not your salvation. And so then you might ask, well, why actually create a cult? Well, the Extinctionati is a different kind of cult. We're trying to draw people away from cults and get them out of cult-like behavior. So cult and the word culture come from the same Sanskrit root. It's quell, as I've mentioned before in other videos, and that really means the hub of a wheel. Think of it more like a drain or a black hole with satellites orbiting around it. Members of a cult are in orbit around this black hole and they're getting sucked in towards the center. At the center there's normally a charismatic leader who's propounding this set of ideas, and the general format of the ideas is it's really a kind of a salvation story. So what normally happens in these kind of cults is you have a charismatic leader. So, for example, our entire Western culture is a snuff cult. All cults are snuff cults. And so our Western culture, or any human culture, will sow the seeds of its own destruction. Now, what normally happens with a breakaway cult is a member of the larger cult, say our society, realizes that we're on a path to self-destruction. So that member breaks away and tries to protect some of the people, draw them out of the dominant culture, tell them that this is the path to oblivion, follow me and I will save you. In so doing, they inadvertently have done exactly the same thing on a microcosmic scale. And they forced into exactly the same dynamic of the cult they were trying to escape. They have a charismatic leader, they have the idea of breaking away and avoiding destruction, or this kind of apocalypse that cults generally assume they're heading towards, and they recreate exactly the conditions they were trying to escape. And then it all winds up in Jonestown with Kool-Aid, or it winds up in, say, Marshall Applewhite and Heaven's Gate and their self-destruction, the Solar Temple. You can see it play out over and over again. And everybody thinks that, well, that's special. It's just happening on the side. But our mainstream Western industrial culture is going to be the one that pulls through and saves us all. And it's like, no, it's actually going to destroy us all for exactly the same reason. So the idea is that the only way you can tackle this phenomena is to create a cult, another one, to get people to break away from the destructive mainstream culture. But then, instead of drawing people into their own self-destruction, is you set them free. So this is a cult to end cultish behavior and liberate people from this perpetual self-destructive behavior. Now, let's go through the video and I'll critique it as we go, and hopefully it'll be really instructive.
Hello and welcome to TEDx Mid-Atlantic. My name is David Troy and I am the co-curator and host of TEDx Mid-Atlantic. So we've been working on a series this fall on defending democracy against undue influence and unethical manipulation. And we knew that we would want to address the topic of QAnon, but we found a lot of the coverage that's out there to be rather simplistic. We started to dig into the topic ourselves and really try to find, where the kind of leading edge of the research on this very troubling topic actually is. And so we found that, another drawback to a lot of the existing coverage was that it offered no real roadmap for how to actually wind this down. And we feel like that's a very important element to this. How does this movement end? And how do we see that happen safely?
So straight out the gate, we're in problematic territory. Why does he want to shut down QAnon? Why does he want to control it? It's a threat. A threat to what? It's a threat to his immortality project. His immortality project is the mainstream snuff culture. So he thinks in terms of democracy, in terms of the industrial society that we have, which doomers know and they're quite clear about is heading for destruction. He doesn't think so. He's got all his hopes in the religion, in the political structures. All his investment in life is in our dominant normie culture. So the whole impetus here, straight out the gate, is that QAnon, as a breakaway cult, is a threat to his cult and his culture, which is your culture.
So when we looked under the hood, what we found were a lot of different things that are all interesting in their own right and some troubling. One is a variety of games that have come together over the last several years and which have been kind of combined and weaponized in really unusual ways. The other thing that we found was multiple cult type organizations that are exerting undue influence on a lot of people. And lastly, what we found was real harm coming to real victims. And it's that last piece that led us to really feel like we wanted to try to put together a program that helped to understand how that harm is happening and how we can stop it. We see that there's people being pulled into cults. They become victims of things like gang stalking and cult mind control, and that there are people who are being victimized by their participation in movements like QAnon. So we feel like that this is a house on fire, and we can either watch on and look at this and gawk and say, look at those strange people with those strange beliefs, or even worse, we could laugh at them, or we could get people out and put out the fire.
Now, I would say the same thing applies to the mainstream culture. We're in the middle of a climate emergency, the 6th mass extinction. We're heading for destruction. We could just sit back and laugh at the mainstream culture. We could intervene and try and save them. But I hope you see that neither cult, QAnon or the mainstream cult, is more legitimate than the other. They're just different vehicles for the same thing. Now, clearly, people in the mainstream culture, they assume that they have all the right because they have the power, because they have the majority. But since the mainstream cult is heading for self-destruction by any measure from a psychologist, any self-destructive behavior is a pathology. So our mainstream cult is not innocent. It is pathological. Now, it never occurs to this guy that basically he's been indoctrinated with years and years of mind control in school and university to believe in democracy. He didn't wake up one day and invent democracy or suddenly come to an epiphany that it is the correct thing. He was indoctrinated by school teachers, by a long series of people that introduced mind control. Well, we politely call that socialization, and we call that education. There's no difference between education, socialization, and mind control. It's just he went through the dominant mainstream mind control, so then he thinks he's not mind controlled. But he's not an independent thinker. He is a conformist, just like all his peers. Now, that kind of conformity can only happen if there's been a mass program of mind control, and that's what our schooling system is and does, and that's what he's been through without realizing that he is mind control.
This was all worked out. It didn't evolve by a lot of rational people saying, we'll take this, this, and this from the past, then the next generation will take this, this, and this. This was set down largely in a handful of places. Prussia was perhaps the most prominent of those places. And the Prussian experiment leaped into the United States almost immediately in the 1840s, leaped into the United States. Its propagandists covered the country here. Its backers, its financial backers, set up the most important teacher training institutes and financed those institutes. And then no one was allowed to become a teacher who didn't more or less subscribe to the fact that experts could create a curriculum and pedagogues could administer it. But the people who gave us schooling weren't these wealthy people. They were utopian thinkers who believed the family and tradition were the greatest obstacles to making a perfect society, a utopia. And every utopia that survived invents schooling long before we had universal force schooling. There were always little neighborhood schools, and they all invent universal schooling of a homogeneous variety in order to reach utopia. Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. These people saw a different kind of utopia through solving the problem of production with high-speed machinery, they saw that material abundance could be created, and that want, first of all, of course, they thought they could become supremely wealthy, which they did. But secondarily, they weren't beasts. They thought that this material abundance, since they had abandoned a belief in a creator or an afterlife, this material abundance was the best that a human life could aim for. And to do that, the family had to be moved off center stage, and the children had to be processed like raw materials. These are the people who saw to it with their influence that when legislation that was wildly radical based on any past model was proposed, that the right legislators would vote that legislation through. They saw to it that money was available to build these vast piles of brick and stone and to drain children out of the community by the force of law, mind you. They're set up to produce a predictable, homogeneous, safe product. They're set up to sort people into occupational categories, roughly consonant with what the current economy demands.
That is what we think that is our ethical obligation, and that's why we're here today, to help limit additional harm to people that are victims.
Now, I take this as a completely bogus narrative. He's trying to backpedal and justify his interest in QAnon as not that it's threatening his cult, but that it's doing harm to innocent people. And so appeal to the mammalian brain and motherhood and apple pie and the children, and he's going to say, I'm going to do Catcher in the Rye and save all these lost children. Not me, not my cult. I'm not preserving my cult. I'm just a good Samaritan. Complete hokum.
Politicians have traditionally hidden behind three things: the flag, the Bible, and children.
So I first wanted to say a few things about human trafficking. So with respect to human trafficking, this is clearly a serious issue. According to the Polaris Project, 25 million people are trafficked worldwide each year. And, no one looks to downplay this as a problem. This is a huge problem, and we need to be addressing it in real and meaningful ways. The issue with something like QAnon is that it seeks to weaponize this real problem in the surface of various kinds of cult recruitment efforts, and that is immoral.
Really? Baloney. He's trying to protect democracy because that's his immortality vehicle. All this altruism and that is just so hollow and false.
People like Polaris Project are being affected by false reports that are coming in based on nonsense coming off of the internet, and that distracts from their ability to actually deal with the very real problem of child trafficking and child sexual abuse that happens all around the world. So part of what we need to be recognizing is that this is a real problem, but it's being misused and misappropriated in the service of this cultish structure.
Okay, but how does he know? It's just his opinion. He doesn't respect the members in QAnon that have a different opinion and a right to that opinion.
So what I wanted to try to emphasize today also is that this is very much a work in progress. You're getting a view inside some active investigations. Various journalists are starting to dig into this in a lot more detail than has been done previously. There's certain things that we're going to be able to share, other things that we're not going to be able to share at this time. But what we wanted to offer you is a large overview of kind of what this structure is, how it functions, how it's affecting people, and what we might do next to try to get it to shrink and affect fewer people. So multiple different teams of researchers have arrived at similar conclusions kind of at the same time. So Isabella Kaminska at Financial Times Alphaville arrived at a connection into this network back in August. and wrote about it. We've connected with her in our research for this program. There's journalists at heavy.com that have released stories about this. And there's a documentary film team that's working on a 3-part documentary supposed to come out in December or January. That's for Vice. We also have developed about 20 or more human sources from all across the spectrum with verbal testimony, written statements, internal communications. And lastly, I wanted to express that the views expressed by our guests are theirs alone. They do not necessarily reflect those of TEDx Mid-Atlantic, my own personal views, or those of TED conferences, of which TEDx Mid-Atlantic operates independently as a 501c3 corporation. So again, this is an active investigation, not intended to be an expose, but it's intended to show a broad outline of what journalists and researchers know right now. So I'm pleased to welcome our guests. Jim Stewartson is a pioneer in the in the field of alternate reality games, and he came to this topic by way of his work in this field. He became actively engaged in trying to understand and interrupt the radicalization of QAnon victims. So welcome, Jim.
Hi, thanks very much, Dave. It's great to be here.
Yeah, glad you could be here with us.
What he somehow fails to mention is that Jim's an ex-Google employee and he's an obsessed 9/11 truther.
With us. So our second guest is Stephen Hassan, and he is one of the world's leading experts on cults and authoritarian mind control. He is the author of several best-selling books on cults, mind control, and most recently is the author of the book Cult of Trump. Welcome, Steve. Glad you could be here.
It's an honor. Thank you so much.
And also joining us this morning is Desiree Kane, who describes herself as a Miwok multimedia journalist. She connected with the research here as a result of her extensive work with the 2016-2017 Dakota Access Pipeline protests at Standing Rock in South Dakota. And yes, there is overlap with that. Welcome, Desiree.
Juxus, thank you for having me, Dave.
Thank you. So I wanted to start by kind of giving an overview of what the current coverage of this, movement and the QAnon scene looks like. There's a lot of discussion about how QAnon is growing in influence and that it's spreading and it's doing this and it's doing that. And we have congressional candidates that are claiming to profess belief in QAnon topics. And it's kind of hand-wringing type coverage where people are like, oh my goodness, this is getting out of hand. What do we do? We see coverage from people like Renee DiResta, who is an extremely excellent disinformation analyst, talking about that this is just the beginning and that they're starting to adopt various kinds of techniques that have been used in Russia, talking about color revolutions. There's been a lot of discussion about how Jim and Ron Watkins are ostensibly the people behind that. And a quick note on that, or people behind QAnon, and a quick note on that, yes, they are in very many ways because they control the hosting of 8kun.top, which is the message board where the Q drops go. They also control a bunch of other hosting related to other aggregators and distribution sites. There is no way that this process can run without these two. So definitely, want to express that this is in no way contradicting, what has been said about Jim and Ron Watkins. They're very much a part of this. And just for background, Jim is up until fairly recently, pig farmer in the Philippines, former U.S. military member, and Ron is his son. Recently, also, there was coverage of a man named Jason Galinas, who was working at Citibank and was running a aggregator / app called qmap.pub, which was serving as a distribution outlet for Q drops and was serving as a major radicalization vector for people that were consuming that content through his tools. And he was outed as being part of this. He was fired from his job at Citibank.
You've got to ask yourself, why was he fired from Citibank? He's not doing anything illegal. These are just ideas that he's propagating. There's no harm so far in what he's doing, but he gets fired from Citibank. My interpretation is that any corporation in America is a cult. they recognize straight away that he's doing what they're doing. They're doing mind control of their employees. They have a set of wage slaves and they motivate them, they manipulate them, they send their managers onto courses on how to manage staff. That's mind control. But they can see that he's got a contrary mind control. And so he's a threat to the organization, the corporation he works for. So they expel him. It's kind of like an organism expelling a virus. It's basically some cell in the organism has now become really opposed. It's almost like a cancer cell. It's now really in opposition to this Kantian whole and now working against it because it has ideas that are cross-polarized against the corporate goals. And so there we have it. One cult expelling a member for starting now a new cult, and this new cult is going to grow like a kind of a cancerous cell.
And he's not central to it. He's somebody that's been distributing content on the edge. And so we're aiming to kind of understand people more at the center of this thing than necessarily people like Jason who are at the edge. There's other groups like Jason that are likely going to be exposed soon, and they are likewise peripheral to this operation. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of some of the things that are being co-hosted alongside with 8kun.top, include things like dailystormer.com, which is a Nazi hate site. And then in addition to that, a variety of other phishing schemes and other kinds of illegal activity.
Now let's take a moment to think about phishing scams. What's the difference between this phishing scam and, say, an advertising campaign from the big corporation? I really don't see any difference. There's no truth in advertising. They are phishing for money. But it's not illegal. Why? Because they're big and they're mainstream. It's only when there's a breakaway cult doing phishing and scamming and conning people, like every US corporation does on a grand scale every day. That same bank is nickeling, diming all its employees and all its customers. It's doing everything it can to put on a little fee here, which is just bogus, and extract money from customers and get them to take products that they don't need, like every other American corporation. But that's not grifting. That's not phishing. It's when somebody else that's not mainstream that does it. Now it's a threat, but it's only a threat because it's breakaway and unaligned with the main system. In terms of ethics or any other kind of measure that you can have, both of them are on par. It's just a question of size, power, and length of time that they've been established.
That are being run out of a company called Van Tech in Vancouver, Washington. All these sites are associated with Watkins and Van Tech and the QAnon distribution channels. So that also has been in the news, and thanks to our guy, Red Rum of Crows here for providing this interesting visualization of this network. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about where QAnon began. And for that, I'm going to let Jim kind of take over here. So what we're going to start talking about first is the idea of LARPing. Jim, explain to us what LARPing is.
The easiest way of thinking about LARPs is the Wizard of Oz, right? The Wizard of Oz was somebody pretending to be somebody more powerful than they actually are, right? Once they get unmasked, it's easy to see the structure and what the motivation was behind it. LARPing has always been around since the beginning of communications. But with the internet, it became incredibly common. Basically, 75% of the people online are to some extent LARPing. It's not their actual name that they're putting out there. And so it's positive in the sense that it gives anonymity. It gives a way for people to express themselves without kind of endangering their real personality. The problem is that it also allows them to hide their motivation. It allows them to hide what it is they're actually doing.
Like a corporation with a logo and an image and a whole advertising department, they also hiding their motivation. They're trying to say that they're here for the good of this and for the betterment of that, and they're all there for profit. Even the non-profit organizations are just fronts for somebody somewhere to profit. A religion's the same. They all absolutely have a persona. That persona hides their real motives. In fact, all the employees in a company hide their real motives. If you go to an interview with a big corporation, one of the things they'll do somewhere near the end is almost always they'll say something like this. Okay, why do you want to work for this company? Now, that's a test. The interviewer knows exactly what the answer is, and it's, you don't want to work for this company, you want the money. So why do they ask it? Well, they ask it so that you, as the potential employee, are put on your mettle to say, will you lie for the sake of a buck? Now, if you tell the truth and you just say, nah, I'm just here for the money, I don't care about your corporation, that's the honest truth. But if you be that honest, you'll be kicked out of the interview. They want you to say, well, I looked you up on the internet and it looks like you're a progressive company that cares about its employees. And there's a big smile on their face because they say, yes, you will put on this mask and wear this persona in the office. You will be a liar. And you will take part in our bigger lie as a corporation where we take all our customers, i.e. suckers, for a ride. So that's how the lie works, and it's no different to what they're saying here and accusing members of a cult of doing. It's QAnon isn't doing anything other than a corporation is doing in America, or anything, the military, any religious organization. Everybody that is working from a set of ideologies and for a motive, usually a buck, then is actually guilty of exactly the same thing. So it's cults, top to bottom. None of them are better than the other. Some are bigger, some are older, but it's all the same phenomena. They're just not recognizing it.
And LARPing became very, very common on the chans, on 4chan, and then subsequently on 8chan. A huge number of LARPs that were going on. There was FBI Anon in 2016, White House Anon, Meganon, all of these kind of LARPs that were happening on the chans.
And explain briefly what FBI Anon and White House Anon were. They're sort of prototypes for QAnon, right?
Absolutely. FBI Anon was, believe it or not, Q is a mainstreaming of FBI Anon, which was a straight up Nazi LARP. It was putting out Holocaust denialism, all kinds of stuff. But it was actually, from a technical point of view, a really good LARP. Whoever it was knew enough about what they were talking about to get a following of people. But the actual message that it was delivering was white supremacy. And that led up to QAnon, and FBI Anon validated Q. Q became a very, very important LARP, and that's what it is.
And just to make it clear to our listeners who may not be as familiar with this as we and some of our other listeners, I'm sure, are, the very first, what we call Q drops came on October 28th, about 3 years ago, 2017. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. They really started it in September. With Follow the White Rabbit, Follow Snow White.
These stoats can be found dashing around the English countryside, chasing down one of their favorite foods, rabbits. But when just chasing doesn't get the job done, the creature turns to an unexpected superpower. The stoat, on the hunt, will go nuts. This manic behavior gets the rabbit's attention, Who could ignore a stoat on steroids? The stoat inches closer and closer, but the rabbit remains transfixed until it's too late.
There was an about a month-long sort of show leading up to the first Q drops at the end of October.
Right. So I think our listeners probably have some idea what we mean by LARPing. It's basically pretending to be somebody that you're not online, and for a variety of different reasons, people might do that. So the next element that we want to look at is the idea of ARGs, alternate reality gaming. And hang on a second if I can get the slide to change. There we go.
So alternate reality games are, they started, and I was part of the team that helped to invent them, almost 20 years ago. Alternate reality games were designed to be fun, immersive experiences that allowed people to live inside of a world that they were interested in or cared about. They were really large. They created community. We also noticed that they could be incredibly powerful, and people would do things that they normally wouldn't. And so what we did as ethical puppet masters is put guardrails around it, stop people from going off the rails. So Dave, do you have that video that we could show a little bit of? So this is one of the first ARGs ever built. It's called I Love Bees in 2004, and it was for Halo 2.
Now, I hope none of this is escaping you. This is a commercial corporation that is using an ARG to promote their product. That's okay. But when QAnon starts promoting their product, which is rebellion, suddenly this is not okay. See the double standard?
We're going to play hopefully a little bit of it here to give you a sense for what that was.
You see that?
Sentry 129, you have a bogey in the corridor on the other side of that door. Proceed with caution.
Whoa. She disappeared.
What do you mean disappeared?
I mean, she's gone. No trace.
There she is again. What? How the hell?
Oh, my God.
What?
She hid on the ceiling.
What the hell?
It all started in mid-July when a mysterious package was sent out, a jar of honey containing 9 letters that, when arranged properly, spelled out I Love Bees. But on July 16th, the day when a theatrical trailer for the upcoming Halo 2 was launched nationwide, the pieces fell into place. At the end of the trailer, a quick flash of ilovebees.com sent Xbox fans sprinting for their PCs. At first glance, the website appeared to be nothing more than an amateur beekeeper's website that had been hacked. But a closer look only resulted in more confusion. What exactly was going to happen when the counter reached 0? It's early in the morning on August 24th. ilovebees.com is just updated with a list of over 200 sites. They gave GPS, longitude, and latitude, and now it's up to us to get to one of these sites to answer what is apparently going to be a payphone, give it a code word and a nickname, and all of a sudden that will unlock an axon. Once all these axons are activated online, it unlocks a hidden message. So far it's been WAV files with gibberish or background story, we think, for Halo 2.
Jen, I've got the pass box over here.
Coming.
We have arrived at a bank of payphones here on 2nd and Colorado. We're waiting for a phone call which should come in, well, within any minute now. So let's go meet the people standing by.
So far, the phrases seem to be pulled from the bits of dialogue. Once all of these dialogues are known, they can be rejumbled into the correct order to, present a story.
Crew member, what is my nickname?
Operator.
What's your name?
This is Onitech Alec with the Berkeley crew.
Lieutenant Watson, Lieutenant John the Man, Lieutenant Mr. Bojangle.
Soldier, what kind of special skill do you offer my crew?
I play guitar.
Where is your guitar?
In the trunk of my car.
Put the phone down and go get your guitar.
Yes, ma'am.
Run. I need you to tell me a joke.
So, what do you call a cow with no legs?
I don't know.
Ground beef?
All right, I think we're good.
At San Francisco Convention.
So I think you get the basic idea, right? It was a big experience. We had people going out into the real world. We had people interacting with both automated characters as well as live characters. So at the end there, when you heard the operator talking, shout out to Kristen Rutherford. That was a live person talking to somebody on a payphone somewhere in the United States, right? So we learned that people would be willing to do all kinds of crazy shit, right? One story that strikes me and that is, I think, important here is at one point, I had built an automated system to ring tens of thousands of payphones. And at one point, one of the payphones that were ringing coincided with a hurricane. And a guy decided to answer the phone in a hurricane. and we said, dude, put the phone down. It's a hurricane.
Except listen to that. If you are a rebellious organization, if you're trying to foment social change, you just heard the code to social change. It's so difficult to do cultural change. If you're a CEO, an entrepreneur, you will find in these business classes that they'll tell you time and time again, it's incredibly difficult to foment cultural change in an organization, and that's normally what a CEO tries to do to change the direction of a company. Their standard techniques to do it, cult techniques, by the way. So just think of the power of that. This is a guy that will pick up the phone in the middle of a hurricane, and he's so dedicated that he will actually risk his whole life. Now, compare that to something like Extinction Rebellion, which is really struggling to get people to put themselves in harm's way for their long-term good. Here is a guy that's doing it for almost nothing. It's the fascination and attraction of a story, a game, and an alternate reality. This is what the state and the power brokers are really scared of in an org. It captures people's imagination, and if you can capture their imagination, you really are changing the dominant narrative and culture and turning people onto a different path. Now that path could be used against the state, and that's what terrifies them. They have all these people under mind control. But what an org does is uses the same techniques. It's really just a psyops. They're using psyops all the time on the civilian population. It's done in the military, it's done politically, it's done commercially, and what it is really trying to steer the population. You go and look at Eddie Bernays, all these things that have been really made into a science. They call it public relations, but it's really public manipulation, perception manipulation, manufacturing consent, and really coercion of people. Just, it is pure mind control that we're under daily. But you can just see how easy it is for some radical group, like for example Extinction Rebellion, that has a different motive to stop the mainstream culture, for example, from actually destroying this planet. Well, it doesn't help to hold up placards and signs and that. It doesn't change people's minds. But an alternate reality game and in the alternate reality format is so powerful that somebody will actually answer a telephone in the middle of a hurricane in preference for actually taking shelter. And I hope that point gets home, is just the sheer power of an org.
Right? The difference between an ethical ARG and an unethical ARG, one designed to harm people, is that an ethical ARG is designed to be fun, is designed to keep you safe, is designed to keep you within a story world. It is not designed to confuse you, traumatize you, and deceive you. And that's the big difference between what we built, almost 20 years ago, what QAnon has turned into.
Right. So I think people have a sense of kind of alternate reality games. And I think, casually, if people have exposure to things like Pokemon Go and that sort of thing, that's another type of this game where, you're out interacting with the real world, trying to find clues, put things together, and, sort of interact with this story reality as well as physical reality.
That's an important point. I happened to be at Niantic while Pokemon Go was being created, and I Love Bees to some extent was a prototype.
In the name of democracy, he's hurt, he's died. Claimed he was a terrorist, claimed to avert a catastrophe. Blind, 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 blind.
Right.
Before
again,
they
the
actually
issue
had
there is
GPS.
what are the ethics of a game like that? Because it can
Precisely.
result in harm to people. And
Okay, that was dropped in so subtly that it almost counts as really subliminal mind control. It says, and it brings harm to people. Really? What harm? It really brings harm to the establishment. It really brings harm to the elites. It's bringing harm to the mainstream cult. But he just drops casually how, it brings harm to people. Well, which people? Not the people in the cult. He wants you to believe that. It brings harm to the current business as usual narrative and our mainstream culture. So it's him that it brings harm to, and all the people on this call. Those are the ones that are worried about being harmed. They couldn't give a damn rat's ass about anybody in QAnon, obviously.
Now, another phenomenon that we've noticed that keeps happening in this world of LARPing and these game worlds is that there's a lot of what we call movement jacking. And without getting into all the details, these are some of the movements that have been hijacked by various kinds of LARPers over the last 10 years or so in particular. And by movement jacking, it's a little bit different than what you might think of as infiltration. This is really about sort of appearing to show up inside of a movement and try to take it over for your own purposes. So appearing to be on board with the movement's goals, endearing yourself to the movement's organizers, trying to map out the key power structures, try to affect those in very specific ways and to achieve specific outcomes. And this is something that we see as a pattern, not just within, say, this particular study, but something that has been happening repeatedly throughout throughout movements that are, being hijacked by people that are aiming to spread disinformation for a variety of different reasons. Jim, I don't know if you have more you want to say about that particular topic, but we'll get into details on a few more of these in a bit, but just wanted to give a broad overview of this general idea.
So, a little mea culpa here. Anybody that's seen my activity on XR Med and my interaction with XR, come clean. It's all movement jacking. But you can see a weak movement will be movement jacked. There were many people trying to movement jack XR. Just the Socialist Workers Front, they were all over it. There were anarchists all over it. There were state operators, and really the whole feel of XR and the whole XR movement, I think it was PSYOPs anyway. Chenoweth, and that is really a government agent. She works for the State Department. And so, if you have a successful movement like XR, people are going to try and game jack it and steer it, and there's a competition behind the scenes. So there's first mover advantage. The people that do the most subtle cult and the ones that are hardest to get their head around, for the average person to get their head around where they're going, are the more powerful cult. But there's almost this Zen-like competition to see who's going to get control of the dominant narrative and steer it away. And so it's a great skill to game jack and to actually redirect a movement, but it's something that has been perfected in the military and the mainstream in PSYOPs. And this is what we have to do, I think, in terms of activism and for, basically radicals, people in XR. You've done your kindergarten introduction into really a rebellion, and now it's time to move up in the ranks, move forward, and you can see that how subtle this is and how we're moving up to the next level. We're all really working to perfect each other's skills, and we're all evolving. Very exciting, and that alone is very attractive in terms of alternate realities and an alternate reality game.
Yeah, just to re-emphasize, there are people involved here that have infiltrated many different organizations, as Dave is showing here. One that I'm just going to point out is Cicada. Cicada was started in 2011, and it was taken over. It was taken over by a group of people who had other goals for it.
And so maybe talk a little bit about what Cicada was started out to be, so far as anybody knows, and talk a little bit about just kind of what it is, how it works.
Sure. Cicada started out as a pretty awesome alternate reality game. It had all kinds of cool shit in it, steganography, cryptography. It was incredibly difficult, and a lot of really smart people kind of gathered around it to try and solve it. And that was, late 2011, 2012. What happened was that a group of people who saw a bunch of really smart people decided to what's called game jacket, which means infiltrate.
It's like that movement jacking that we were just
precisely. Yeah. Exactly. It's movement jacking, but in this case, it's game jacking because Cicada is an alternate reality game. But what they did was they infiltrated it, took it over for themselves, started LARPing as the original Cicada team, and started inserting radicalization and indoctrination materials into it.
Yeah, Cicada 3301, fantastically well done. Very, very sophisticated and very complex. So it's well worth going and studying Cicada 3301 and see how they really structures the rabbit holes and how difficult it was. It's really a filter and a recruiting mechanism. So Cicada 3301 was a huge success for the operatives that did it and the puppet masters, but it really is an outreach campaign, a large funnel that comes down to a very small number of quality recruits. Think of it in terms of the opposite of XR, where it's a big tent where you say one and all, we come and we do numbers building, we take anybody. Well, the net result of that is you get factions, you get people freeloading, bandwagon effects, people that don't believe even that there's a climate catastrophe, they just want to promote left-wing agendas and stuff like that, and that's where XR is going to end up. Now think of that in terms of being the polar opposite of filtering out people, getting rid of the dead wood, making sure that you have a very few people with the same mindset. Once you have that mindset and that small kernel, it's then like growing crystals in something like copper sulfate solution. The crystals are going to grow with the same alignment. I was going to say enlightenment, which is, yes, also part of this. They're going to grow with the same alignment as those small seed crystals. Now, if you just start with a big catchment, all the participants are going to be misaligned. So very naive and rookie mistake that the founders of XR did in terms of XR, but this is the way it goes. Start small and then add slowly. Why it's not an entirely glacial process that takes forever is that it starts to build exponentially. Each one of those crystals will recruit two or more, and it's like the pandemic. It's basically a exponential growth function. It's just like amoeba dividing and dividing and dividing, and each time becoming a bigger and bigger superorganism. Something which never happened with XR because it's disintegrated with factionalism. But that's the secret of how to do it, is to start small and grow from a kernel outwards, instead of trying to gather in a whole army of misaligned interests.
Ultimately, Cicada became the bridge to QAnon.
Right, and I think one way to frame it might be that the original creators of Cicada, appear to have done so with, some ethical compass, and then that ethical compass became eroded as time went on, and different people started to take over how it was operating.
Precisely.
Okay, I'll share this with you for free. Cicada 3301 was not actually game jacked. It was so sophisticated that it did its own game jacking. It really, once it got to a certain phase, it morphed and kind of changed gear into the next phase. Very, very sophisticated stuff.
Okay, so and also it's probably worth noting here that it was towards the end of Cicada's, sort of prominence in the 2016-2017 timeframe that some of these other LARPs, this FBI anon, CIA anon, Meganon, started to become in sort of beta testing as the idea for Q sort of percolated and eventually kind of broke through.
Dave, can I just comment real fast?
Absolutely, yeah.
So two things. In addition to movement jacking, destructive cults create front groups with topical themes in order to bring people in. So I just wanted to add that. Right. And Jim shared with me a 5-minute episode of a video game called Assassin's Creed that had inserted into it Cicada 3301. And I've been trained in hypnosis since 1980, and it was very hypnotically programming people to the beliefs.
Right, and it contains hypnotic music and words.
Exactly.
And, there's just classic techniques for how to actually do that stuff that's, clinically proven and scientifically valid.
Okay, that reference to Assassin's Creed is really important. I didn't know anything about Cicada 3301 in Assassin's Creed, but I looked at Assassin's Creed very, very carefully with a fine-tooth comb, and I was very, very impressed with the way they actually manipulated the direction, just the background in terms of philosophy, even in terms of the archetypes they were using, the Jungian archetypes, and even to the extent where they actually pulled in streams from the occult and esoteric philosophy. Really, really well done. In terms of the game structure and how they evolved the game, there are lots and lots of references to anarchy. It left me with the idea that it was politically motivated by rebellious anarchists, and really a prepping ground, a kind of a massage, psychological massage for what came next. I hope you realize the number of threads that actually come together in the final, really, the failed insurrection on the 6th of January. But yeah, the rabbit holes go really, really deep. That's all I can say.
It included the concept of internet radicalization, which is an odd thing for it to include in Assassin's Creed.
Absolutely. So we know some of the people that were behind that, and it was, we think, fairly intentional.
My poor friend Frank Morris, his son dropped dead of exhaustion after finishing an 18-hour shift. Frank is consumed by grief. He blames the government for refusing to protect the rights of the worker. I can't blame him for his rage, but I fear his actions have gone too far. He plans to steal a shipment of nitroglycerin and use it to attack the Houses of Parliament. Killing people and destroying property solves nothing. Democracy is the only road to socialism.
So the apple was created by the people of the first civilization to control humans and use them as slaves or a workforce. The pieces of Eden were the only real things which survived the Toba catastrophe and so continued to live on with the world. The humans began to recover these artifacts and caused a split of sides within humanity based on the mindset of the people. The assassins, who sought to use these pieces of Eden for knowledge and guidance, and the Templars, who wanted to use these pieces of Eden for control and to bring about their new world order.
Pick one.
No!
Let her go.
My back! My back!
Let her go.
Let me go! No! No! Let me go! My back!
So another project that we came across in research for this, and which was known to people involved in this, project over the last few years, is something called Project 89, and the exact origins of that are complicated and go back several years to a variety of strange groups of people. But Jim, I wondered if you wanted to highlight this topic of apophenia that was highlighted here. And for those watching, this slide is worth reading as much as you can kind of take in quickly, and you can Google for this stuff and find more of it.
Now, I want to draw your attention to this in great detail. I suggest you pause the video here and read this from the beginning to the end. It's crucially important, and in particular the closing paragraphs. It says here, eventually all of reality will become consumed within the project. So this is the alternate reality, is the way to get culture change to move to a new reality. Its process is as inevitable as history itself, because it has defined itself. It determines the events, it writes the story. This comes sort of from the Matrix as well, as the superorganism emerging out of this collective intelligence. We enact it, we write it, we sell it, we pull all of the culture towards ourselves. And then again, this is a cult, basically. We're pulling the culture towards ourselves because all of culture is part of ourselves. All of culture is a cult. All that is occurring on the world stage is the plot line of this game. Now, this is very, very deep stuff. And the end result is evolution. So, yeah, this is, how far back does this go? Well, this game goes back to the beginning of civilization. It's lost in time. There's so many strands. If you go back and studied it, there's more than a lifetime in studying it. It's what the Zen Buddhists call Makyo. If you look too deeply into this, you'll be sidetracked and you won't make any progress, because you'll be caught up in this tangle of complexity where you'll just be lost in the brambles and kind of consumed. The thing is to keep forging ahead, and you have to take some things just on trust. So eventually the result is evolution, the singularity. The end result is a new civilization. You win the game when you evolve, nothing more, nothing less. Now, this is a nice idea. It really means that the whole of the collective organism, the humanity as a whole, really reaches enlightenment and continues on to a new age. I have very bad news on this score, that yes, it will happen. The problem is that it's cost an entire planet to get there. So in other words, we haven't made it. We've fallen short of the post of this singularity and this massive evolution. We haven't managed to get to the next stage because we destroyed the planet in getting here. It's this entire humanity, call it the entire cycle, has been aborted. We just cannot make it. You can try, but it looks like the ecological tipping points have happened and we're in planetary runaway in terms of destruction before we reach the sociological tipping points. So the experiment has been a failure. Where do we go through now? Well, we carry on as if it's not. We might be wrong. There might be black swans. There might be some small group of enlightened people that squeak through, and so we have to carry on regardless. If you really concerned about this point, then have a look at my videos about the ripeness is all just going through catharsis. But really, if your motivation is to reach the singularity and you're turning this ARG into your immortality project, then it is a cult and it will fail in the same way cults do. It's much better to accept that we've failed. As the experiment, our species, it was aborted and it's failed. So you just have to accept that and carry on. The heroic thing is to carry on and make a good show of it. to go down fighting is the way.
Jim, give us a description of this apophenia concept.
Absolutely. So again, this project was put together. This proposal was put together between 2009 and 2012. So this is 8 years ago. When we were building alternate reality games, we saw that if we didn't give people guardrails, if we didn't tell them, hey, there's a puzzle here, look here, they would, in our vernacular, drive themselves crazy, looking for things that didn't exist, looking for connections that weren't there. And we learned really quickly, stop that, make sure that they know that these are the guardrails, this is the curtain, here's reality, and here's the game.
Okay, now this is a crucial point, and it's quite hard to understand. Now, he thought that it's ethical to put guardrails on, otherwise people will drive themselves crazy. What does crazy mean to him? Crazy means that you become a non-productive slave. You fall out of the norms of our mainstream society. So, with his limited understanding, he assumes that that's wrong. But in actual fact, that you really need to go crazy. Crazy in terms of our slave narrative and the current culture's narrative. The more people that go crazy, the better. Why? Because you need to have a breakdown in order to have a breakthrough. The restructuring of your entire worldview, which is what this ARG is for, really amounts in the parlance of our prison culture, our slave culture, the dominant culture that is now failing, calls that insanity. It calls that a mental pathology because it doesn't fit with its cult narrative. But it is actually your savior. It's the shamanic journey. Shamans and these psychedelics and ayahuasca, all these psychotropic drugs, these are inducing a psychosis in you. So go and watch some of the videos they've done in terms of malpsychosis and eupsychosis. So there is a malpsychosis, that's communal garden broken psychosis, which will see you sitting on a street corner talking to yourself, and there's eupsychosis, the shamanic breakdown. It's the initiation. It's almost like a psychological rebirth and enlightenment into a new way, an entirely new way of thinking, where your entire world is turned upside down. But you have to get over the idea that, you know, driving people crazy is a no-no. It's like, no, that's the aim. And ARG's aim is to drive people crazy. Driving them crazy is to give them ayahuasca without giving them any sort of a drug. So it's very hard to understand because you've been indoctrinated to be scared of any kind of radical thought, any kind of transformation, because they want to keep you indoctrinated into this dominant culture, and the dominant culture is a slave culture, and they want to keep you productive. They don't want any of the slaves going off the reservation, and that's why LSD is banned, because it's a class 1A drug, because it basically creates a different mindset, and that's a challenge to the conservatives, to the elite, basically the people that are actually controlling us. So they don't want you liberated, so they don't, and that translates in our terminology to they don't want you crazy, but you do want to be crazy. The ARG is designed for you to go crazy, and the apophenia will basically take you along the paths that are preordained in a kind of a navigation through a psychonautical world that is really almost a teleology. It's really almost a mathematics of transformation. But if you put guardrails around that, you really will distort people's discovery, and you will really stop the butterfly emerging from the pupa. It's kind of like squishing the pupa down and not letting it break out here, and not letting the right enzymes transform the pupa so that it can emerge as a butterfly. They're trying to keep you in this little pupa and this chrysalis and not emerge as a butterfly. The process of emerging as a butterfly is entirely self-destructive, and that self-destruction is, in our language, going crazy. So, but it's going crazy for a reason. It's going crazy to go through a trauma of rebirth. Deep stuff, but I'm sure you'll get it once you get more involved. And have a look at some of my earlier videos where I try to explain all this.
In QAnon, they do the opposite. Apophenia has been described by some as kind of a pre-schizophrenic state. Forgive my phone. It's a pre-schizophrenic state where what you're trying to do is make connections between noise.
Got some good noise there to make connections.
I apologize. It's done now.
Okay.
So like, and I said this in the Financial Times video, if you're looking at a TV screen with snow on it, if you look long enough, eventually your brain will create images, will create content, even though it's pure noise. And that's because of this concept of apophenia. If you are presented with noise, your brain does not know how to handle that, and it puts you in a very, very vulnerable psychological state.
Professor? Is this all real? Or is it just happening inside my head?
Of course it's happening inside your head, Harry. Why should that mean that it's not real?
In QAnon, they combine that with incredibly traumatic material. If you've ever seen people talking about this and crying about the children, that's because they've been traumatized, because they've been told.
We lost your audio.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I got a call. So they've been told that if you care about the children, you have to become involved in this game. The apophenia, what it does is it opens you up. It makes you feel like there has to be connections here. And what Q does specifically, what that LARP does, is encourage people to get into this state.
You see, what QAnon is doing is attacking all the layers of your brain, and the appeal to, pedophilia, child trafficking is a raw appeal to your mammalian brain and your maternal instincts that male and females have. So they can easily traumatize you by really confusing that part of your brain, really putting it under stress. The aim is trauma, and trauma is actually part of transformation. So it's the way it is, kids.
Right.
It will say spelling matters. Grammar matters.
There are no
Finding
coincidences.
patterns.
Mistakes
there are no
matter.
coincidences.
Right.
Mistakes matter. All of this bullshit, pardon my French.
Okay, it's bullshit to him because he doesn't understand. He's really stuck. So the spelling matters. All of these things matter because it's kind of on the path. Think of Freudian slips, for example. We're trying to get through your intellect. Now, all the discombobulation, all this turmoil inside the lower layers of your brain, not lower layers, let's call them older layers, the primal layers, they are actually sending messages up and changing the intellect so that it makes Freudian slips. Now, if you into Jungian psychology, there are no Freudian slips, there are no mistakes, and that's really what QAnon is saying. It's hocus pocus and nonsense to this guy because he has his defenses up, and his intellect has his defenses. Is saying that none of these things, these are illegitimate connections. It's his intellect defending itself against really an attack on it. So these connections are real, and when you start down the path of this, you will be starting what psychologists would say you're getting pre-schizophrenic. You're starting to see these connections that other people can't see in words and letters and the details, and it becomes a lot like punning. You can see meaning in a word salad that other people would reject as being nonsense, bullshit. Anytime somebody says the word shit, you know it's coming from the top layer of their brain. If they say fuck, you know that's your reptilian brain waking up. Those two words are really closely tied with the neurology in those two layers.
That doesn't actually contain any content or connections at all, but Q is purposefully creating this vulnerable state.
You see, he hasn't made the connections, so he thinks it's random noise and it's a threat and stuff, but he's an idiot. Apophenia can in mild psychosis be illegitimate connections. But what he's really scared of is you'll make connections that he hasn't made yet and are not legitimate according to the mainstream cult. So it's a threat to make those connections. But he's a dipshit. He doesn't make those connections. He thinks they're not legitimate. But not because they're not legitimate. It's really just because they're threatening to him as connections that are not acceptable in his worldview and not acceptable to his psychological map. But this is a new map, and clearly he's not evolved enough to actually understand it. So he thinks they're illegitimate connections, but who's he to say? He doesn't even understand the bigger picture.
Right, and if you read this here, it says this game will require the participation of millions worldwide. Eventually, all of reality will become consumed within the project, and you win the game when we evolve. So the question that you have to ask here is, okay, who's the game master? What are they thinking about here? Is it ethical to inflict something like this on the world at large?
But is it ethical? I mean, come on. We're talking about a culture that is destroying the planet, its own habitat. We're in the 6th mass extinction. There's a climate catastrophe. There's an ecological catastrophe. There's this world gone mad. And he says, is it ethical to change that? Well, you see, he doesn't believe we're heading for destruction. He believes that democracy and normalcy is going to see us through climate changes in 2100. He's not a doomer. He's fine with this prosperity cult. He doesn't think his cult is a threat or even not going to succeed, where all the evidence is stacking up, saying the mainstream cult is going to destroy our entire planet. I think it has already, in fact. We've probably passed the tipping points, but he doesn't believe that. So he's talking about the ethics of changing my world and having a new one. Well, it would be unethical to do business as usual. And the way to break out of business as usual, the formula, the code that Gail Bradbrook was looking is an alternate reality game, is to make the new reality into a game, a harmless game that really changes everything.
To be frank, this is a thing that is floating around on the internet. There's a lot of things like this floating around on the internet. But what we can say with some reasonable certainty is that this was, among the kinds of documents that people that were investigating, building out this concept were looking at. And, it's kind of been in the bloodstream and has been for some time. So it's kind of an application of an idea that has been around for a while. So in terms of looking at what is under the hood, when we actually start to investigate the details of the people and the overall structure behind, this movement, I hesitate to call it a conspiracy theory because it is actually a destructive authoritarian cult, as we'll see in a little bit.
Dude, whoa! Who's got the, destructive authoritarian cult now? America is a destructive authoritarian cult. It's just his cult. So he forgives it. But it's like, really? Yeah, cite to me how QAnon is a destructive authoritarian cult. Hang on a minute. I mean, I don't want to defend QAnon too much because, you've got the orange psychopath and stuff, but hang on. If you're looking for an authoritarian, destructive cult, it's the cult that these guys love. And it's got this bullshit democracy narrative, which is a complete lie. It's got authoritarian oligarchs and plutocrats that run it all, and it's destructive. So please don't come with the ethics. It's just so hypocritical.
But what we found were a variety of different networks of people, among them some cults. So the first is this group called I Am Theosophy, which is a theosophic religious cult that was started in the 1930s as kind of an offshoot of previous kinds of Gnostic religious traditions, coming from people like Blavatsky and Crowley, as well as listing Rosicrucianism as a kind of a forerunner and a compatible set of beliefs to this. But it's this kind of idea that you can become an ascended master, and that, there's this occult knowledge that you can obtain, and that the sort of patron mascot of I Am is Saint Germain, this character on the left here with the yellow hair and the purple background. Let's just say that some of the beliefs of this particular network are pretty interesting.
Ooh, it's almost like there's this giant, I don't know, what would you call it, conspiracy, maybe?
I mean, who the fuck's got the cult here? You getting this yet? You can't make this shit up, dude. You can't. You don't have to. It's real.
Jim, I don't know if you have more you want to say about the whole Saint Germain thing, but yeah, they worship on Mount Shasta. They allegedly, that was where the founder of I Am allegedly first came across Saint Germain, was on Mount Shasta in California, and it's an interesting belief system. Jim, do you have anything else to add there?
Well,
or Steve?
I would just add personally that theosophy was something that was incorporated by the Nazis.
Well, it took a while, but we eventually got there. The boogeyman scare word. It was the Nazis. Ooh, children, let's all get into it. Okay, now it took a long time, but eventually we cut to the chase. The Nazis embraced it. So the Nazis also used flush toilets. So let's ban those, shall we, children?
It's not all theosophists are Nazis. I don't mean to imply that, but
no, many I think are just seekers, and there's
seekers.
nothing wrong with being a seeker.
Yeah, and nobody is trying to portray people's legitimate beliefs as anything but genuine. But these particular groups make it so that your beliefs aren't genuine.
Citation needed? Look, these beliefs are pretty genuine. I mean, if you storm the Capitol building, I'm going to say there's a level of sincerity here.
And in this particular case, this philosophy has been used to do very, very bad things, including Nazi Germany.
Right, as opposed to the Christian cult or the Zionist cult, they just sweetness and light, aren't they, all the way down the line. I mean, they've never been used to do anything wrong, have they? Oh, come on, please, man, please.
Just as an example here, this is a little video clip of some folks that are associated with this set of beliefs. And it just gives you a little bit of an idea to kind of where their head's at.
For freedom and divine justice shall not perish from the earth.
Okay, now that takes me back to every single school pageant we had at Easter, and I went to a strict Anglican school.
Now we'll end it there, but it goes on to play the national anthem, and one of the other beliefs that that particular group has is that their spiritual leaders can actually be reincarnations of the American founding fathers, including George Washington, which is sort of interesting.
Wow, seriously wacky beliefs. It's almost like that other one. What's that guy's name? Jesus?
Dave, if I could just jump in and say that the whole Ballard, thing came to my attention back in the late 80s with a cult called Church Universal and Triumphant, where the leader channeled a message, a prophecy that Russia was going to nuke the US and started building bunkers in Montana. They were into weapons, they were into doomsday philosophy, and this whole thing has been researched, and there's an excellent set of videos that my colleague Joseph Zimhart has put up on YouTube explaining, because he was involved with CUT, Church Universal and Triumphant, and with his knowledge, you can have a really deep understanding of the whole history of this.
Yeah, we can definitely point you to a lot of resources on this topic. And this is just a short video clip of Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Is that correct, Steve?
This is not Elizabeth Clare Prophet.
Okay, so this is another CUT person, I believe, talking about channeling Saint Germain.
We have a great show, and we have a beautiful lady sitting here who's ready to tell us all about herself. Azina Romanda, welcome to your own show here.
Well, hi. I don't feel like it's really my show. I'm just kind of a visitor for a few minutes.
You are. You're a visitor for a few minutes. You're going to take off in about 5 minutes, right? So we better get to know you before you leave here.
Okay.
In all seriousness, you do what is called a full body manifestation, and Saint Germain speaks through you.
Well, Saint Germain enters the body, and my consciousness completely leaves, and I go to a plane that is of another dimension.
Okay.
The suspense is killing me.
Wait for it.
This is part of the setup. It's called creating anticipation.
And what she's doing there in the region of her yoni is creating an involuntary response in your reptilian brain. Now you notice how awkward those guys were waiting for that silence. They had to fill it with a bit of speech there because they didn't like that build-up and anticipation. It's basically their alien cortex. It could see that basically something stalking it, and something sure was. The mammalian brain and the reptilian brain leaping out to get their intellects, and that's what they're defending against. Hence the little patter to cover over the awkward silence.
This looks like Ramtha, actually, Jay-Z Knight.
Okay, so you kind of get the idea of where we're going with this. She has become Saint Germain.
Yep, I get it, straight to the yoni. You see that little symbol she makes right in her crotch? Just basically female genitalia. You know who else does that? Angela Merkel. She's also a master at this kind of shit.
Let her talk as Saint-Germain. Oh, never mind.
I feel like we're torturing people.
Well, it's not really torturing people, is it? It's torturing him. It's torturing this part of his brain. It can feel the threat.
Point being that there's people that really are believing this stuff, and there's another person with a different group. This woman is called Ramtha. And what's the name of her group, Steve?
No, so she supposedly channels a 27,000-year-old dead spirit from the continent of Atlantis called Ramtha.
And
she becomes
Ramtha,
the warrior. Couldn't resist. Sorry.
Gotcha. Yeah. So this is another person that has endorsed, QAnon and Trump and all this, and it's this network of networked cults and strange religious groups. So another group that is in the mix is a group called Iglesia Ni Cristo, which is a Philippine church. It is kind of an apostate branch of the Catholic Church. They do not believe that Jesus Christ is their main leader. Rather, they instead worship the church's main leader, and they also share the habit of voting as a bloc, and have voted in a bloc in the Philippines to support President Duterte. And interestingly, they acquired a town in South Dakota in 2011 or so for about $700,000. And I wanted to switch now to talk to Desiree a little bit about, why is it that this strange Filipino church is purchasing a town in South Dakota, and how did that interplay with your interactions at Standing Rock?
Well, so I believe this group, it's actually about the proximity to sacred sites. And if people are part of the No Dakota Access pipeline fight, it's important to understand that these groups have been targeting our, and I say our as an indigenous two-spirit, they've been targeting our communities and our movement spaces since, at least the late 1960s. And I mean that broadly as in different cults or cult-like groups who are trying to gain access into hard-to-reach spaces. And when you think about movement jacking, gamification, and groups who are part of radicalizing people into certain ideologies, it's a thing that definitely is happening. So in the time of COVID, it plays out as misinformation campaigns. But when you look at what happened over the course of the fight against Energy Transfer Partners over the Dakota Access Pipeline, misinformation campaigns were a key tool used from what seemed like within the movement and from all of these different outside entities. We thought about the federal infiltration. We thought about infiltration from mercenaries, but what we didn't think about was ideological folks who are coming into the community, coming into our movement spaces, to essentially gain access to those hard to reach places. So if the goal is to bring people into a more radical right-wing position that we know costs Indigenous lives, think about Save the Children as an example happening in the Dakotas right now. These are all very familiar colonization tools that we are all very familiar with, but with the digital components and gamification built in.
Oil is life, and sometimes you've just got to grab it by the pussy. That's why we've teamed up with Big Oil and Big Banks to bring you the Dakota Access Pipeline. Once completed, it will transport shit tons of fracked crude oil to our refineries, where it will go on to fuel our commitments under the Paris Climate Summit to not give a shit about climate change.
So when you look at just this one group, it's hard to say, okay, well, what is this one group that bought this town in scenic South Dakota? Like, how do they go into Standing Rock? My point is, without naming names, that we have members who are LARPing, who are playing literal games, who are aligned with different groups who want access to sacred spaces. All of these groups are a threat to tribal sovereignty, and we need, as we know, prior and informed consent, and that is not what's happening. So in the movement space with No DAPL, with Occupy and others, there needs to be a deeper look where people are asking questions about who was there, what was their funding, and what were their ultimate motivations? Because as we know, the No DAPL movement was targeted and ultimately imploded.
This glorious pipe dream will also create thousands of local jobs, for a few months. The only thing standing between the empire, the government, and total planetary habitat self-destruction is a rebel alliance of native tribes who've come together on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation to peacefully protect the land and water for future generations. Ew. But don't worry, we're dealing with them in a culturally sensitive way. Enough wasting your taxes to invade countries on the other side of the world to get oil. This, folks, is the original American way, invading Native American lands to get stuff we want.
Right, and that was largely because of that targeting and the kind of, psychological kind of warfare that was employed against some of the people that were acting in good faith. So in some ways you have, but go ahead, yeah.
One thing I have to say, though, is that the American public should be looking at what happened with No DAPL and with Native Americans and Native American movements, because they've been handled in malfeasance. And I appreciate the work on this call and of all these researchers and journalists, because ultimately what happened with No DAPL can be expected to scale.
That's the spirit we're keeping alive today with the Dakota Access Pipeline, bringing you double the value by screwing both the past and the future in a single blow. Authorized by the Department of Homeland Invasions and Eco-Settle Pipe Dreams.
And we're seeing it. In order to stop it, we have to be transparent about what this direct threat to tribal sovereignty looks like.
Now, my feeling on this is that the left wing in general has come to an all-out gunfight and total war with a placard and a banner drop. I don't think transparency and all this kind of wishful thinking is going to make any headway against this kind of psyop. The way to fight back for Indigenous people and for this comrade here is to do a counter psyop and get involved with exactly the same tools and methodologies, and to fight back in this new mind space. You can't avoid this battleground. This is the new battleground, and it's time for the left wing to hone their skills. The left needs to get over this instinctive revulsion for conspiracy theories. It is wall-to-wall conspiracy theories in the halls of power, and you can't escape that. You have to enter into the fight, so you have to go into the matrix and tackle it on its own terms. You can't avoid this with some kind of expose or something. An ARG is so sophisticated that it will use your expose, turn it on itself. It's all part of the technique of the mirror, which I've gone into before, but you can see in other videos. But just basically what I'm trying to say is it's time to get sophisticated. It is time to evolve. Otherwise, you're not going to meet this challenge. At the moment, it's on the right wing. The left wing needs to just catch up.
Right, and some of the people that were involved with the No DAPL, movement jacking, as well as, those people. Some of those same people were involved with Occupy. They have been involved with Cicada. They're involved with Q now, and the amount of overlap between these situations, I think, is quite remarkable. And I think it's also worth noting that people would be surprised to find out that some of the people that have helped to drive QAnon are not at all necessarily ideologically right-leaning. They are merely in it for the power that comes from hijacking movements. And so, what they did at Standing Rock and what they've done at Occupy and within other contexts, hasn't been about ideology. It's been about power.
Right, that's what it is all about. It's all about power. Nobody really believes any of this horseshit on any of these sides any more than the state believes in the church. It's just a good cop, bad cop team to manipulate people and keep power. Now, notice that these four guys are also on a power trip. They're trying to deprogram people from a cult. Why? To assert their power over them. It's all to do with our ego and basically our intellect. And it's trying to suppress, it's trying to keep the dominant culture going and make sure it's the powerful one that wins through. But ultimately, it's all a power game, and these are all just tools to power. It's tools that the left has to now step up to and get proficient at using, because we're falling behind in the race.
It has. And, I think people don't know what to look for. They don't realize that these folks, they look like well-meaning kind of hippie folks, maybe. They don't look like rednecks, as it were. It's, I don't mean that.
Yeah, right, I'm tolerant. I don't use trigger words like rednecks because, I'm not a racist bigot. I mean, I don't use the N-word.
But in a way that's derogatory towards rednecks. They can go do whatever they want, but they don't look like that.
Right.
And so we need to be looking with a broader lens that perhaps could be a little more nuanced for our security of our movements and security of democracy as a broad concept.
And do you notice how subtly that was just slipped in there? The go-to word for our dominant culture, democracy. I mean, really, do you have any kind of democracy in a representative democracy like we've got? A liberal democracy? You actually think it's functional? You think the democratic system actually works so that the people are in charge? Come on. Who's being duped by a cult here?
And just to kind of bring this around, I think people just don't know to look for people who are LARPing in this context necessarily. They assume that most people that show up and put in the time are acting in good faith, but in fact, there's often a lot of people that are acting in bad faith within the context of these movements. One other thing I wanted to just mention was that a videographer that was at Standing Rock with some of these people that hijacked these movements was also the videographer who made the film Plandemic. And we don't need to name names, but I think that that's a very interesting thing that people might want to know.
And I would add that it's recruited a bunch of people into QAnon specifically.
Yeah, exactly. So you see direct overlap between, Standing Rock and QAnon, and the sort of anti-COVID restrictions and, the whole COVID misinformation situation, and then even overlapping into things like anti-5G. So we need to keep moving along a little bit, but I wanted to dip into this next network a little bit, which is called the International Tribunal for Natural Justice, which is something that first came on my radar personally doing different disinformation research back in March around specifically coronavirus and 5G misinformation that was being put out. But if you notice here, there are two intelligence professionals here who are part of this ITNJ group. And a key focus for this ITNJ group is, they've got this inquiry into human trafficking and child sex abuse. That ought to sound familiar if you've been studying QAnon and, reading what their messaging is.
And just in case you forgot, at the beginning of this video, they did actually admit that there is international child trafficking going on. So it's not a conspiracy theory.
And the reason for that is because there is direct overlap between this International Tribunal for Natural Justice and QAnon. In addition to that, there's also overlap with people from Hollywood. The guy on the right is the founder of ITNJ, also a group called Humanitad, and a thing called the New Earth Project. So what I'd like to do now is to play a short montage video made by one of the key researchers on this project, Arturo Tafoya. Big thanks to Arturo for putting this together. And it'll give you a little bit of an idea of what the ITNJ is all about.
In August 2011, Humanitad Foundation established a law commission to serve as international observers for the trial of former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, who, at the time, was facing the threat of assassination. This was the seed for a series of discussions which would ultimately lead to the formation of the International Tribunal for Natural Justice. By the 14th of February 2015, thousands of men and women, hungry to herald the dawn of a natural and just order on Earth, had ratified the treaty. The ITNJ was proclaimed into existence.
Notice those signatures there? They signed in blood.
This becomes the voice of the people. Thumbprints, signatures.
Let me just point out that pedophilia does not stop with sodomizing children. It goes straight into terrorizing them to adrenalize their blood and then murdering them. It also includes murdering them so that they can have their bone marrow harvested as well as body parts. Pedophilia is much
This is the original growth hormone.
Yes, yes. What we're not at yet is people realizing that it includes satanic rituals, the murder of children, the drinking of blood. That's the final veil. I'm a commissioner on the International Tribunal of Natural Justice with Sasha Stone and the Chief Justice and many others. In fact, Cynthia McKinney, I think, will also be a commissioner. We have a year-long project on pedophilia that is going to blow the top off this thing.
Now, I know you want to just, sweep this aside and brush it under the carpet as Pizzagate and all nutty right-wing stuff, but before you do that, just think of Jeffrey Epstein and the strange circumstances of his death, and Google Marc Dutroux in Belgium, his little Belgian embarrassment and kind of cover-up, strangely, and the Brabant killings. What can I say, dude? It's like rich and powerful people, they get bored and they need to get their kick somewhere. I mean, what do you do when you have everything? You start going dark. You start going into the occult. I'm sorry, I mean, that doesn't fit in with your nice liberal world, and you think all these people in Personality magazine and People magazine are all squeaky clean, and if they weren't, you would hear about it. But it's weird. It's weird up at the top. All I can say is it's much weirder than you believe, and don't write these guys off too quickly until you've actually done your own research.
Domestic child abuse is the most hideous of all child abuse. The basic objective is to systematically terrorize children until they are forced to dissociate. The torture is the execution of a well-planned, well-thought-out ritual, often performed by close relatives. The only escape for the children is to dissociate, where they will develop a new personality to enable them to endure the abuse. This new personality is very helpful to the abusers.
Okay, that is actually totally correct. It's standard shamanic technique. It goes back to ancient times, and it's rediscovered by military, rediscovered by interrogators like the CIA and these kind of alphabet soup organizations. It is rediscovered by psychopaths on their own, and it is a legit part of self-transformation that you would go through in, say, Zen dojo, an ashram in India, to actually do spiritual development. So it's a technique that can be applied to anybody, and it can be used for abusing anybody. But it is a goal of a cult to do that, to transform people and break their ego. A lot of people have a vested interest in breaking your ego. If you go to a military, basic training is part of breaking your ego. If you join a gang, say a street gang, they would have hazing rituals to break your ego and reform your ego around the predominant cult that you're being initiated into. So this is actually standard practice, and all cults really have to do it to reform people's personality and their ego. But, you know, what happens after that is the thing, is what's the purpose of getting rid of their ego? Is it to liberate them, or is it to mold them in, make them plastic so that you can put them to a new use in slavery to another cult? So that's the key difference.
Once the abuse is over, the core personality is not conscious of what happened. Dissociation also serves the purposes of the occult because the children have no day-to-day memories of the atrocities. They go through adolescence and early adulthood with no active memory of what is taking place, but continue in rituals through their teens and early 20s, unaware of their involvement. The victims lead relatively normal lives until they get triggered and flashbacks or nightmares occur.
Now, this also happens in tribal initiation rituals. It's not that the entire practice is actually evil. It's the use that it's put to. In the dominant culture, we've got rid of those initiations, but there is a price to pay. And some of the consequences of neglecting this kind of ritual is school shootings and drug addiction. A lot of the problems that we have today, the social problems, originate from the fact that we don't have these kind of rituals embedded in our tribal society as hunter-gatherers might have.
There are about as many native Canadian religions as there are First Nations, each with its own collection of deities, legends, rituals, and superstitions. The Blackfoot of the Prairies, for example, had their sun dances, brutal ceremonies revolving around pain, sacrifice, and physical endurance. The Ojibwa of the Great Lakes had nuanced beliefs regarding the consumption of human flesh, considering the practice justifiable in times of war and horribly dangerous in times of famine. And the Haida of the Queen Charlotte Islands had their carved cedar masks representing the various spiritual entities that populate their mythology, wearing them in their dances and shamanic ceremonies. In spite of their fundamental differences, many of Canada's pre-Columbian religions share a number of curious similarities. Be it a raven, a coyote, a hare, or some legendary ancestor, the mythology of nearly every Canadian Indigenous group includes the escapades of a trickster figure, perhaps due to a shared belief that laughter, like smoking and fasting, facilitates communion with the divine.
Now keep in mind that this is, and always has been, about money and power. It's about keeping the drug cartels, violent gangs, human trafficking, sex trade, child trafficking, child porn industry, and human slavery as alive and lucrative as possible.
You see, what they're calling out is international criminals and gangs, what they're doing on the fringe, but governments do it too to normal citizens in a liberal democracy. So it's not the technique that's at fault. It's really, all of these people are out for power and money, but the state system is too, and you know, corporations and banks are actually protected by these kind of rituals done in the context of, say, the military or in the school system, for example. They are actually milder forms of this kind of indoctrination, and the four guys on this call are actually, you know, victims of the industrial cult initiation into these kind of practices.
To give you an idea of the large sums of money involved, some children, even immigrants, are used in snuff films and dissected live for organ harvesting for Planned Parenthood, and their body parts sold to hospitals for between $90,000 and $225,000, depending on the organ. Children with great DNA are also sold to families willing to buy them. Many of us have heard of the excretion called adrenochrome. The Satanists remove children's adrenal glands right after they've been terrorized and right before they are killed in rituals to extract this Kool-Aid the elites use to sustain their youth and extend their lives.
Okay, so I think you get a little bit of a flavor for what the ITNJ is there. And, what's really kind of remarkable about that is that there's direct overlap between that group and this group of former intelligence community members that have been amplifying various kind of Q messages over the course of the last few years. Specifically, there's two groups that we wanted to highlight. One is called VIPS, which stands for Veteran Intel Professionals for Sanity. The other one is called JTF MAGA, which stands for Joint Task Force Make America Great Again, just as you might think. And then there's a variety of other message amplifiers that have endorsed Q, promoted Q content. And, we don't need to get into the details of all of that right now. But if you get a sense of all the different people involved here, this is people that have legitimized this movement. And for people that are consuming content and may not be familiar with all the machinations of Washington, these people look legitimate. They sound legitimate. What people in the intelligence community will generally tell you is that these folks are on the outer fringes of, kind of the mainstream intelligence community and have become disaffected for various reasons. And, you can read up on various aspects of that.
And I think that's legit. All these people in QAnon, they are breakaways from the dominant cult. As I said, they're making breakaway cults because they've seen that our dominant culture is actually destructive. Now, when they break away, they've been trained in PSYOPs, in all these alphabet soup organizations, and so they're using the techniques of the mainstream cult outside the cult, and so they are a threat to the mainstream cult. That's their only crime. But we need to really get a cult together that frees everybody from the splinter cults, from things like QAnon, but also from the mainstream cult, these alphabet soup organizations, and ordinary citizens in America that don't realize they are also in a snuff cult.
That one thing I wanted to point out here is that there's a character called E that's apparently close to Michael Flynn. We believe we have some idea of who the identity of that person is, but they're very much involved in advancing QAnon messaging. The other thing that we found within this set of networks is the intention to try to weaponize intelligence against American citizens, and in many ways the idea of using intelligence to, try to say that folks are, pedophiles or plant, child pornography onto their hard drives, which may sound familiar from current headlines, is a repeat of the strategies that were used in 1999 by Vladimir Putin to gain power against his adversaries. So there's some very disturbing parallels here in the notion that we have this kind of set of wild card former intelligence professionals that are doing things like writing memos that align with Russian interests and that sort of thing should be disturbing to everybody.
Yeah, and they were also used for PSYOPs and the alphabet soup organizations in America, and it was really America that developed them in the OSS along with Britain and Eddie Bernays and all of that thing. So its origins are actually in the West, so don't get too Putin on this. Putin was just taking and running techniques that were developed all over the world, including in Asia during the Korean War. But these mind manipulation techniques have been a long time in development, and you can see them really being developed quite a lot in the 1950s. Research was done that is now being put into practice. Not conspiracy theory, all of this, I'm sorry to say it is all fact, but Putin is just playing the same game that we play in our dominant cult in America. We invented the game, and he's just playing along with it. In some ways he's doing it better than we do, but yeah, it's hard to tell because it's all smoke and mirrors in this game.
I don't know if you have more to add on that, Jim, but that's kind of my take on this.
No, not for now, other than to say, just take a look at each of these individuals, and you decide for yourself which team they're playing for.
Okay, and they're all the legitimacy and the credentials, all the PhDs and the doctorates, they all come crashing off the wall in a mess of politics. You see, it's a power game, it's political, and yeah, it's time for the left to start playing the same kind of game. You can't really escape it. But here the guys are, and it's really, what's the big sin of these guys? Well, it's not my cult, it's the right-wing cult. If they were doing this for the left wing, well, I would cheer them on, right? See how hypocritical it is? These guys are not professionals, they're partisan, and they just cult versus cult. That's the situation we're in.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's, these are established networks. We're not making this up. You can look up this VIPS group and the JTF MAGA and, look at the various kinds of ways that this group of people has been validating this set of messaging.
I would just add, if I can, Dave, that some of the people that I've talked with in QAnon universally talked favorably about Michael Flynn. And this is a tell for me. They all don't think Russia is a problem. They all don't want to talk about Putin as an authoritarian dictator who has, intelligence agents acting. So that's a tell. Like, what's behind QAnon? That people who are believers in QAnon have such a neutral or positive view of Russia. Huh?
Right. Just to amplify that, no, if you think about what the message of QAnon actually is, it hates America.
Oh, you see, it hates our cult, and I have an ego that's vested in this American cult. Don't touch my ego. Oh no.
And nobody seems to notice, nobody seems to care. That's what the owners count on, the fact that Americans will probably remain willfully ignorant of the big red, white, and blue dick that's being jammed up their assholes every day. Because the owners of this country know the truth. It's called the American dream, because you have to be asleep to believe it.
It hates what America really is about.
Well, it's anti-institutionalist. It's trying to tear down our institutions at core.
Yeah, damn right. Those institutions are killing the freaking planet, dude. What's wrong with you?
Fourth generation warfare.
Where Native folks go wrong is that we say, okay, well, the U.S. has been so terrible to Native people.
Right.
Perhaps, being the enemy of my enemy is our friend, but it's not. They're not our friend.
Oh, it's not. Really? No, sister, it is.
Right.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's a typical theme with folks that have, various kinds of disaffectations with, the way things are going in this country. And look, things are not going perfectly. There's no way you can say that. But at the same time, aligning with Russian interests in order to create change in this country is not productive. And we need to be able to have our democracy intact. We need to be able to have our institutions intact in order to be able to control them and run them, productively. So.
And this is the dominant line of the dominant cult.
Thousands of local jobs.
We need to be productive. Yeah, sure we do. Like, we haven't done so much production that we've destroyed the entire ecology. We have to preserve all the institutions that did all this planetary destruction. I mean, come on, dude, grow up. We need to get rid of this shit. And as soon as possible. It doesn't matter if it's QAnon or Putin or anybody else. Basically, it's time to get effective and tear down these structures. So the way to do it is with these psyops, it's with an ARG, it's with these cult tactics. So yeah, they've been doing a great job on the right. It's time for the left to step forward and start doing the same thing.
Just to move on a little bit, there's another kind of base layer to this whole thing, which is the distribution channel of various kinds of YouTubers and bloggers and that sort of thing that help to push this stuff out. And if you notice in the first couple of images up at the top here, there's people that have appeared in previous slides that are helping to legitimize these otherwise unheard of quote unquote journalists and documentarians who are putting out content that wouldn't pass any kind of normal fact checking or anything like that under other kinds of journalistic rubrics. So this is kind of the base of the pyramid. And then I would also add that there's a whole nother layer of kind of people that oppose these people that are also helping to amplify the content. And, it helps to create this kind of ecosystem of noise around this topic that, were it not to exist, none of this would be happening. I'm sure many of these people will be working on other things, but, it's kind of a perpetual motion machine. And this is kind of the base of the pyramid. This kind of describes, the multi-layered aspect that we've identified in terms of the structure here. So kind of at the top, you've got this network of disaffected former intel professionals. And so, what that tends to do is to lend legitimacy to this whole thing because they are saying stuff that maybe they know from having worked in government, and maybe they still know people in government, hard to say. But, they're sharing information and ideas in a structured way that, actually kind of makes sense from a government and intelligence standpoint. And then underneath that, you've got kind of this command, control, and coordination layer that is often based in coercion, various kinds of cult dynamics that we've talked about, within these groups.
Could I interrupt 1 second?
Absolutely, yeah.
These first two layers there. I want to just demystify the idea of psyops a little bit. The people many of the people at the top of this pyramid are very expert in psyops, military psyops.
Yeah, working with the Army and CIA.
Psychological operations is
that's
what
right.
psyops
Psychological operations.
Active measures is the Russian term for.
That's right.
Well, that includes some more stuff too, but yeah, it's kind of all in the same family.
Yeah. So I just want to demystify the idea that psyops are some kind of science fiction. They really are not. They've been around for almost as long as the military has been around. And it's really important to understand that QAnon at the end of the day is a massive psyop.
Yeah, and it has its roots in things like research that was done with MK Ultra, and you start talking about MK Ultra, and people go, "This is conspiracy theories," but that stuff's real, Yeah, so talk a little bit about MK Ultra, Steve, and kind of the actual reality behind this, as opposed to the imagined conspiracy.
Yeah, very briefly, because we're running out of time. I came to this whole field of cults and brainwashing and mind control because I had been recruited in 1974 into a front group of the Moon Organization, a group that was the subject of a congressional subcommittee investigation into Korean CIA activities in the United States. And little did I know, but in the height of the Cold War, MK Ultra researching mind control, trying to create a Manchurian candidate, there was a real issue of North Korean brainwashing and 2 coups in South Korea. So there was, if they're doing it, we should do it. And the Moonies were chosen to do the counter brainwashing of South Koreans. And then it was exported to the US, which is where I got recruited at Queens College. Long story short, after 2.5 years, I was deprogrammed. And what helped me get out was learning about Chinese communist brainwashing techniques from people who studied MK Ultra and other forms of this military intelligence stuff. And I've spent 44 years now and written 4 books on the subject of what is involved in mind control and brainwashing, and how do we help people wake up and get out of it?
Yet remarkably, in all that time, he hasn't seen that his deprogramming was actually reprogramming into another cult.
And honestly, meeting Jim was a revelation for me because I'm an old fogey. I'm 66. I've never done video games. I had no idea about alternate reality gaming. And then through what you've taught me, Dave, and these other great documentaries that have shown how platforms create addictions and how basically 21st century mind control is coming through our computers, through our smartphones 24/7. You don't need to be in an isolated compound to be mind controlled into an authoritarian cult anymore.
Touche! Welcome to Western consumer culture.
Right, and we'll have a few minutes. We're going to run till 2:30, so we'll have some time to get into, you know, some of the things around.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, sorry if that wasn't clear, but yeah, we'll run till 2:30.
Yep, them boys are slaves. They've got them running by the clock, and they don't even know it.
Okay. So yeah, and you know, so beneath this kind of you know, sort of coercion layer is this distribution layer where, you know, you've got these YouTubers and bloggers that are pushing out content, and then beneath that you have all of these followers that are sort of the QAnon devotees that are coming from many different on-ramps. It's like what you were talking about, Steve, is that there's different kind of audiences that end up being functional for pulling in different people with different interests. So you've got kind of the Trumpers, you've got the Flynn people, you've got the pastel Q people, you've got wellness and yoga and new age, and then a variety of other sort of conspiracies and cults that are sort of compatible with the idea of, like, you know, we're not being told the truth, so therefore let's seek the solutions that will be the truth telling rather than the things that are sort of perceived as to being lying to us.
Right, and this little Boy Scout thinks that the mainstream media is telling the truth. Yeah? Dream on, boy.
And what I think is startling about this, if we look at that structure and the way that we've identified it based on the empirical observations we've been able to make, it matches up perfectly with this, Steve, and this is from your work. Maybe you could just kind of talk about that comparison for a second.
Yes, so I mean, the bottom line is destructive authoritarian cults, and they come in many types of things: religious cults, political cults, therapy cults, commercial cults, which includes traffickers, multi-level marketing pyramid schemes, cults of personality.
Nation states, NGOs, corporations, military organizations, etc., etc.
And I made this graphic to show that the vast number of people involved are actually on the fringes and at the base, and they have no idea what's going on inside the pyramid, or certainly not what's at the top of the pyramid. That was my experience. Even as a leader in the Moon Cult, the Koreans were the master race and us Americans were the slave race.
Yeah, fits.
For them. But it's a critical concept because I hear people saying, how could QAnon be a cult? Or how can, and because of control mechanisms to take people away from their critical thinking, their ability to reason, often isolating them from family and friends, poisoning people's minds against them so they get more isolated and therefore more dependent and able to be controlled.
Right, just like schools, colleges, and the military.
But the people who gave us schooling weren't these wealthy people. They were utopian thinkers who believed the family and tradition were the greatest obstacles to making a perfect society, a utopia.
Right, and I think that it's key to kind of recognize that most of the people that you know, have been pulled into this and are thinking that, you know, Q drops contain wisdom in some form would have no idea that there's all of these different cults and intelligence professionals running psyops and, you know, strange people kind of in the middle trying to control them. But that's in fact what's going on, and I think we can say that with some confidence. And
if I can say, the general public blames the victims. They say only stupid people believe that, or crazy people, or weak people. And that's not my experience at all. Very intelligent, educated people from good families can get deceived and manipulated into one of these mind control silos.
Mm-hmm. Mind control silos like academia, perhaps, or corporations, churches, the military, maybe?
And if something is true, it will stand up to scrutiny. But what's happening is an assault, even to the point where the public and the media are saying we live in a post-truth world. And I say that's nonsense.
Well, let's be consistent here, buddy. You trust the mainstream media news sources. They say it's a post-truth world. Why do you disagree with them? I thought you trusted them.
Truth still matters. We live in an age of influence.
Right.
And unless people are able to discern ethical influence, as Jim was saying, gaming with guardrails based on safety and protection of the participants, the unethical side, the dark side, are authoritarians, usually malignant narcissists who want power, money, and sex and control.
Yes, and look at what we have in our politicians today. Narcissistic, power-hungry authoritarians. That's why we need these ARGs, to work against them and get rid of them.
There is exploitation, either sexual, financial, some type of exploitation of the members.
There's a small problem with this definition of a cult.
It's a value judgment more than it is a functional word.
Right.
And they don't want laws. They don't want rules. They just want to control and take advantage of others.
This guy is on the left wing, but he's an arch conservative. He wants his prosperity cult, as it barrels towards destruction of the ecosystem, creating climate catastrophe. He wants it preserved. He wants the status quo. He wants business as usual. Of course he does. It's his cult.
Right, exactly. And that's kind of the thing, is that ultimately this movement isn't about right or left-wing ideology. It isn't about save the children. It is about mobilizing people in pursuit of power for power's sake.
No, that's what these knuckleheads are doing. It's about removing authoritarian power. These guys represent the authoritarians. They've got it exactly the other way around. They're trying to do a psyops on you with this frickin' video.
Exactly. Yeah. And I can tell you that I've been working with victims of trafficking. I've helped to co-develop with Rachel Thomas and Carissa Phelps and Delita Miller the first program to help sex trafficking survivors understand pimp trafficker mind control.
Right.
Because
and
then they can get
basically
free.
Their own kind of cult leader. I mean, it's the same kind of thought process.
Exactly.
Yep. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about gang stalking and specifically some of the techniques that people involved in this set of networks have been using to intimidate people, to kind of push them psychologically over the edge, and to ultimately try to control them. And I can't think of two better people to kind of talk about that right now than Jim and Steve. Jim, do you want to maybe get into kind of like some of what you've seen with this topic of gang stalking? And I think start with a definition of what gang stalking is.
Sure. Gang stalking is actually one tactic of psyops on individual people, right? They use basically psychological torture to traumatize people, to dissociate them, to terrify them, to insert phobias into them so that they will comply with the cult leaders' demands. And this particular topic gets me a little emotional because I have talked to many, many people who've had this done to them.
Mm-hmm. It's and specifically in the context of this set of networks and QAnon.
That's correct. And it's horrifying. I've seen these people attack minds. They attack people's minds. They tear them apart. They dissociate them. They specifically experiment on them to get to the very core of who they are, and then insert information and goals and ideas that were not there to begin with. Right. I have seen this in many people, and it is one of the worst crimes that I can imagine because it leaves people with permanent, devastating damage.
Okay, why does this guy find that so traumatic? It's because what the cult is actually doing is destroying an ego, and he's very egotistical. He really represents our egotistical, self-centered, individualistic Western mindset. So he doesn't want to give that up. It's a horror to him. It's basically death to him. So he's trying to keep death at bay, and that's why he finds the very idea of giving up his selfhood, his identity, and his ego, destructive as it is to the planet and the ecology and himself, he doesn't want to give it up. And that is the power of a cult. It can get you to do that. Better make sure that it's to liberate you and not to enslave you.
And these are people that have, needed to seek, psychological counseling, exit counseling from cults, talking to practitioners like Steve, who have helped them to see what happened to them.
Yep, pot, meat, kettle. He indoctrinated them and convinced them by brainwashing that they were brainwashed. Get it?
And it's super traumatic. I know, Desiree, you had, a lot of people within the NoDAPL community that were very traumatized by what happened there, mostly because they didn't really understand what exactly took place. And, actually getting a grasp of what happened is somewhat helpful.
Yeah, and who helped them get this grasp and formulate this interpretation of what happened to them? Maybe the high priests of our dominant culture?
Yeah, I think folks didn't know who we were looking at and what actually was happening, because there is a need for development of lexicon within different communities around how these things play out. So from the outside, it looked, and personal experience was that it was probably mercenaries who cast a wide net and then tried to influence our lives even after the Standing Rock movement space.
Right. And I know many of you felt traumatized for months, if not years afterwards.
Oh, the darlings, they felt traumatized, almost had their egos ripped right out.
Yeah, but it's important to know, we have this list of, at the very beginning, of movements that were targeted. And it's important to know that within those movements, we understand how social networks operate these days and how people can look at them and analyze them and kind of play puppeteer with them, unfortunately.
Right.
So it's important to know that those are the movements that were targeted, and gang stalking is one tactic. So I look forward to there being a lexicon within movements for justice that is substantial and lasting, because so much of this happened already and has been going on for decades. We need to figure out how to have retention, because this is a tactic that multiple entities use.
Now, it's a basic part of cult behavior to develop a lexicon and lingo, a jargon within the cults. It's the same as any kind of profession, like lawyers or doctors or computer programmers. In more distant history, in the medieval times, the guilds would have their own lexicon. What it's to do is to create barriers between the in-group, the cult, and the out-group, everybody else. And what's interesting is you can see these four are actually developing their own cult lingo for their psychiatric cult or their psychological cult. See, psychiatrists and psychologists are actually in their own cult with their own lingo. They have their own little book of spells, which is the DSM, the Diagnostic Sorcery Manual, which is full of all these words that they just made up to reinforce the in-group and the out-group. So here, once again, the pot is calling the kettle black.
Right, and people just don't have great vocabulary about this. Steve, I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit too about this idea of kind of overwhelming people and then, unfreezing them and then refreezing them in terms of, injecting the payload, that sort of thing.
Sure. So essentially, Edward Bernays, who wrote the 1920 book Propaganda, was really the first person to connect psychology with politics and business.
And he was Freud's nephew, if I recall
exactly.
correctly.
And it's evolved. Goebbels tried to hire him for the Nazi work, but he based all of the Nazi work off of Bernays' work.
Okay, what he quickly glosses over here, just chuck in the old Nazi scare word. What happened to Eddie Bernays is that he was instrumental in forming the culture of the 21st century. Eddie Bernays went over to the dark side, the Allies after the war, and created the culture that we live in. You see, the establishment was very worried that all these GIs would come back from the war and cause social unrest, and particularly communism. They thought that World War II was just an interlude and then they'd get back to the Great Depression. And Eddie Bernays instructed them on how to handle mass coercion, mass mind control, and it was essentially done by consumerism. And he showed the way we live in the world that Eddie Bernays created. Now watch how quickly Stephen Hyson glosses over this fact and moves on, because he doesn't want to face that he's actually a cult member and he's actually just recruiting people or bringing them back into the mainstream cult from a breakaway cult.
But my point is things have gotten more and more sophisticated as we understand social psychology, as we've been studying neuroscience, etc. But the concepts are pretty clear patterns. Like when you're in a mind control cult, there's never a legitimate reason to leave.
Okay, now that's bullshit. He thinks that there's never a legitimate reason to leave because he dropped out of his cult. He didn't graduate from his cult. He's a cult dropout. He's a failure in a cult. What the cult is intended to do is to break your ego and liberate you with enlightenment. When you're enlightened, that's it. You've graduated. You leave. But you see, he doesn't understand that because he's not a graduate. He is not enlightened.
Right. Within the cult. So people are given phobias that if they leave, they're going to go crazy.
Well, if you leave halfway, you are going to go crazy. You're going to go malpsychotic. You're supposed to go eupsychotic. It's the same way as interrupting a birth right in the middle of it. It just turns into an abortion. He didn't complete his birthing process in his cult. So he doesn't understand that, and he's just recruiting for the womb of our global industrial suicide cult.
Or if they leave, they're going to commit suicide. Or if they leave, they're going to be hit by a car. And in some of these more nefarious cults, they will arrange those things to happen that drive people into a hospital, etc.
It means a psychiatric hospital. The people that are driven to psychiatric hospitals are people that don't complete the program in their cult. They don't complete the shamanic rebirthing process. So if you interrupt it halfway, if you get to the point where your ego's about to be crushed and you turn around and run for the safety of psychologists, well, they'll take you in with open arms and they'll help you patch up your ego. But of course, you'll be a broken misfit. You see, because you've wound up in the hands of psychiatrists and psychologists, they can point to you as a broken individual. And you see, they say, well, that's what happens in a cult. That's why cults are dangerous. Well, look at the mainstream cult. There's an epidemic of opioid abuse. There's an epidemic of violence, of trauma in the home. Just look at the jails are filled with the refugees from this guy's mainstream cult, our liberal democratic super cult. But he doesn't mention that. He doesn't mention the damage of the system. He just singles out the victims, the guys trying to break away in these splinter cults.
But the idea is also to spread fear to anyone else involved with the cult. Look what happened to them.
I could just shoot him down for saying conspiracy theories and nonsense, all the same stuff he's accusing all these other guys from doing, these phobias. He's doing this right here, right now. He's saying, don't join a cult. You see, they'll get you with the car, some of these cults. You know, he's spreading phobias. He just mentioned how cults do that, and there he's caught red-handed doing it.
Right.
They got stalked they're in a mental hospital.
They got sued.
And listen, I started speaking out in 1976. And I was designated a suppressive person by Scientology in 1976.
That's a badge of honor.
With Paul.
Look, I loathe the Scientology cult, but I gotta say, I'm with them on this one. This guy is an oppressive personality.
Cooper, who they broke into her apartment and typed a bomb threat to themselves on a typewriter, the old kind, and almost got her put in jail.
Really? Who's the crazy conspiracy theorist now?
I mean, so the tactics of cults to harass critics and former members goes back 44 years for me. It's just now on steroids in the digital age. And unless people have this framework, this education to discern the difference between ethical influence and unethical, and I know you have a slide coming up later, Dave, on this.
Right. Now, this guy doesn't seem to have the self-awareness to realize that every cult claims that they're the ethical ones and everybody else is unethical. So what do we do? What do we use as a yardstick? Well, I would say we use the clinical one and say, which one is self-destructive? Now, if you look at this guy's mainstream cult, the global industrial civilization, it is heading for self-destruction. You don't have to be a doomer to see that there's climatological collapse, there's ecological collapse. We're on the brink of the Third World War. We're headed for destruction from so many angles that our culture is destroying itself, his culture. So to claim that somehow these breakaway cults are unethical, they really are trying to do the same thing he is. They're trying to preserve themselves. Are they going to wind up in Jonestown drinking Kool-Aid? Probably. But so is our mainstream culture. If this guy gets you back, puts you in the mainstream culture, makes you feel safe because now you're in the majority cult, you're not safe. You are then in the suicide project that's global and far more dangerous than any breakaway cult like even QAnon or the Scientologists or any one of them.
Unless they understand the control techniques and how to protect themselves, people can be manipulated. And you were asking about the unfreezing, changing, refreezing. I first learned about that in '76 by reading a 1961 book by Edgar Schein called Coercive Persuasion. And it outlined breaking down somebody, disorienting them, confusing them, overloading them in order to ready them for indoctrination. That's the changing part. And then the refreezing of the new belief system, the new ideology self.
Right, and if you've ever done military training, that's exactly the process they put you through. If you've been through college, that's exactly the process they put you through.
And in my case, I went from Steve Hassan, who was an English writing major, who had a ponytail, to a right-wing fascist who thought Moon and his wife were my parents, throwing out my poetry, fasting for Nixon because God wanted Nixon to be president. I became a right-wing fascist and turned my back on my Judaism.
Wow. He turned his back on the Zionist cult. Now, do you see how powerful cults are, alternate reality games? Do you see why this is a contentious battleground? This is the area of psyops. So he's just told you how powerful this is. Now, if you want cultural change, this is the gold standard. Alternate reality games, cults, and these tactics. So he's going through exactly the tactics we need in a cult. A cult with a difference, and that's to break people out of cult behavior. But since the mainstream cult has them captivated and in this destructive trajectory, we have to draw them away into a new cult with a new alternate reality game so that we can deprogram them from all ideologies. You know, this is very powerful stuff to, say, make somebody a communist or a socialist or a national socialist or a Zionist or a capitalist. You can take people and mold them this way. But the gold standard, I think, is to get them to ditch all ideologies, to set them free. It is the shamanic tradition, it is the old tradition of liberating people. So you can't draw them back into the mainstream cult. You have to set them free. And I think this is the way to do it, is to use these techniques to capture slaves. You can actually use them to capture and release the slave.
Right. And I think in the end, that shows that this kind of process doesn't really have anything to do with ideology. You didn't believe that stuff, kind of at your core. You were sort of programmed into it by replacing your normal milieu of friends with different people that all of whom were exerting a kind of social influence on you.
Exactly. And a critical concept is informed consent or lack of informed consent. And I think any legitimate group should tell you up front who they are, what they believe, and what's going to happen before they start pressuring you to join. But destructive authoritarian cults of all types withhold vital information, distort information, or outright lie about who they are and what their agenda is.
Yeah, informed consent. Yeah, like you got when they baptized you as a baby and started filling your head full of religious nonsense. I don't remember giving my consent to be schooled into the mainstream cult and to go through the educational system. And I was drafted into the military without my consent. I don't remember consenting to have to go out and get a wage slave job. If it was my choice, I wouldn't do it. But they've set up a system where you have no choice. There is no consent in the mainstream cults. So don't come with this bullshit about consenting cults.
And I think that what's unethical about this QAnon situation is that we have this happening at a massive scale involving dozens of countries, around 80 countries, and hundreds of millions, millions of people. We don't know exactly how many millions, but it's probably greater than 50 that are being influenced by this, and they don't know who they are being influenced by, because no one knows who the QAnon organizers are per se. That's patently unethical.
Oh, please give me a break here. Are we in fairyland? Do you honestly know who's behind the political parties you vote for? Do you know who's behind the news organizations of the news you read? All the NGOs? Do you know what the CIA is doing? Do you think they get informed consent before they topple governments and influence people and swing elections? I mean, come on, get real. In this world that we live in now, what's real? What's real behind the advertising that you get? What's real behind the products you get? What's real behind the censorship you get? Really, in an age of big data and AI, to come out with such bullshit is just... what is this Boy Scout? He really thinks that he's not being manipulated, that he gives his consent all the time because he clicks, yes, I'll allow cookies when he goes to a website?
Yeah, I just wanted to say again, some of my sources have had what Stephen described happen to him, basically online, through email, through DMs, through Discord servers. They're able to do that exact same technique to break people, literally break them down, dissociate them, insert their own ideas, and then rescue them from that situation. It's psychological torture in order to provide undue influence on people.
Yep. And Dave,
one issue that is going to be really important is putting laws in place that make it illegal to do this. I'm here to say this is one of the worst things I've ever seen done to human beings, and it needs to stop. It needs to be illegal.
Great. So we make this illegal, we send SWAT teams into these people's homes to disarm them, and we drag them before federal courts. Okay, and these courts are not going to be any kind of authoritarian control. They're just going to be arms of the state that examine people fairly, decide whether they've done any thought crimes, and then put those offenders in cages.
And I wanted to call out, Dave, your TED Mid-Atlantic talk with Professor Carroll and Brent Allpress, highlighting the great hack and people you may know. And there's one other one that's very popular, Social Dilemma. These 3 documentaries can educate everybody just how much information has now been gathered on all of us to know which buttons controllers want to use. And this data can be purchased on the dark web for anyone who wants to know how to do it.
You heard the man. Get it, use it, and use it for devastating effect.
And in the United States, we have no privacy protections, established by law for this information, and it's being used against us to tear America apart and create conflict and chaos.
Woo! The American cult is being torn apart. Oh, it can't come soon enough, dude. Can't come soon enough.
Instead of supporting democracy.
And to be really blunt, we don't have any laws that prevent retired military intel professionals from running psyops on the American people.
That's right, because this isn't North Korea or China, which this guy obviously wants it to be.
We don't have any laws that stop that from happening.
So if I can just say one more thing, I'm finishing a doctoral program, Dave, where I explicitly have been researching the legal system and undue influence and what laws can be used. And in fact, Keith Raniere of Nexium is sitting in jail waiting to be sentenced on 7 felony counts, including trafficking, even though the word cult was never used, and I don't think the word brainwashing or mind control was used. But there are federal statutes against trafficking that I believe can be used against anyone who's using unethical mind control.
Okay, and that also applies to would-be cult deprogrammers, these psychologists that sell themselves as deprogrammers for people in cults. They generally run foul of the law, and they run foul because they get these kids, they kidnap them. In other words, they fall foul of human trafficking laws because the families demand that the kids are drawn out of the cult and deprogrammed, in other words, reprogrammed into our mainstream cult. But those same laws apply. So if you're one of the deprogrammers, you're also guilty of kidnapping and trafficking children, even if it's to take them out of your cult and to basically try and brainwash them back into their family's religion or the mainstream cult, whatever you want to brainwash them in. But whatever happens, none of these guys are interested in freedom of thought or any kind of freedom at all. They're interested in just bringing people back into their cult.
So clearly there's a need to advance that conversation, to look at that from a global perspective, try to borrow from best practices from other countries that maybe already are exploring this issue in more detail than we are. And then we also need to consider what needs to be done at both the federal, state, and ultimately local level to, really have people understand that, this issue of undue influence is a severe problem in our society, particularly within the context of the digital realm.
Okay, and who decides what undue influence is? If I influence you to, say, buy a pack of cigarettes, is that undue influence? If an advertiser influences you to drink some sugary drink that's not good for you, is that undue influence? If I influence you to buy an SUV that's destroying the planet with CO2 emissions, is that undue influence? I mean, where do we draw the line here? Who decides? Well, obviously, it's the government. And what's the government? This guy's cult.
Is this undue influence? How about this? Or this? Is this undue influence? Especially when it leads to this. If I trick people with a viral marketing campaign with mysterious guardrails designed to herd people who have not been pre-informed towards buying a commercial video game product that glorifies war and trains young kids for the military, is that undue influence? Obviously, the rule that's being put forward here is that if you use a cult or an ARG against the things that these guys love, like capitalism, church and state, then according to them that's unethical.
Commander, we've got a problem.
But what if you think the establishment is corrupt and destructive and capitalism itself is unethical because it's based on wage slavery, debt bondage, and undue influence of mind control like this TED Talk, for example?
Purdue Pharma has long told a story, which is essentially that the Sackler family, which owns the company, has a real arm's length relationship, is not actually all that involved. And the Sacklers have developed this reputation as great patrons of the arts and universities who never really have to talk about the family business, which is the source of all their wealth. What's fascinating about this filing in Massachusetts is that you have hundreds of pages of documentation from inside the company showing very, very active involvement from multiple members of the family who are members of the board, but not members of the board who are at some distance, members of the board who are very, very actively directing Purdue Pharma in pushing OxyContin even after this epic public health crisis that we're all experiencing now.
Give us an example.
Striking. So in 2007, Purdue Pharma actually pled guilty to criminal charges of misbranding, essentially deceiving people about the dangers of the drug. 3 executives pled guilty. The company paid a $600 million fine. And one of the big interesting questions has been, all right, well, if that was the turning point, was that when they kind of got wise? Was that when they realized, oh boy, okay, we may have transgressed a little bit in those early days, but now we know what's going on. And we now have this documentation showing that not just in 2008, 2009, but in 2016, 2017, when the country is reeling from this epidemic, inside Purdue Pharma, they're still thinking, how can we push this drug?
You say there were parts of the filing that included them trying to have an influence on both academia and hospitals. How did they do this?
Well, this has been part of the strategy for the company. And I should say not just Purdue, but many companies. Purdue really has excelled at it, and the Sacklers have. In terms of, first of all, influencing doctors. All right, so there's all kinds of relationships they have with doctors. They realized early on that a doctor is more likely to prescribe a new drug if it's another doctor recommending it. I thought it was almost like putting an athlete on a box of Wheaties, right? You listen to the people you trust, your peers. So they started paying doctors. They, funded research. So you get this crazy situation in which you're a physician and I'm a physician and I come to you to tell you about this new drug. I'm paid by the drug company. I show you a study that's been done about the drug, which was also paid for by the drug company. We have this conversation over an expensive steak dinner at a nice resort in Florida, and we're all getting sent there by the drug company. One of the statistics in this filing is that Purdue's budget just for food bought for physicians who prescribe opioids every year was $9 million a year.
That's a lot of nice steak dinners.
And the really interesting case now is that for decades, part of the reason the Sacklers were able to kind of burnish their own reputation was by giving huge amounts of money to elite cultural institutions, to museums like the Guggenheim, to universities like Yale. So at what point do these institutions start saying no to that money and potentially taking the Sackler name off of their various institutes and buildings?
All right.
Let's face it, none of these guys has a halo.
Every prophet of every major religion can be considered a charismatic leader. In fact, the biggest joke in religious studies is that cult plus time equals religion.
Yep. So I wanted to turn the rest of our time, which is we've got until about 2:30, we've allocated for this, to talking about how QAnon ends, and to kind of loop back from where we started with, a lot of the media coverage and reportage of this situation are very much kind of the hand-wringing variety, where it's like, this is growing, we don't know what to do, it's a problem, we've got candidates that believe this stuff, oh goodness, it's bad, we don't know what to do. So my thinking is that we need to start to visualize how this starts to come to a close.
Round them up and herd them into boxcars, right?
And I know that Steve, you have tremendous, experience working with cults as they fall apart. You know what a cult in decline looks like.
Sure do. Looks like our civilization right now.
And so the question that I would have is, how do we make this ultimately, societally, a cult that's in decline? And how do we make sure that as it's in decline, it kind of comes apart in a way that's safe and ethical?
Okay, so the mask comes off. Mr. Freedom of Mind, who doesn't want mind control, he wants the law to come in on his side and on the side of his cult to crush the opposition, to make sure that this doesn't happen again, because he wants people to have free thought. Really? but not the kind of free thought where they're actually free, just the kind of free thought where they think like him. Yeah? Okay, dude. Okay.
For the people that have been subject to undue influence. So I have several of your slides here. What I'd like to do is maybe have you go through some of these, talk about that general theme, and if you'd like for me to advance the slide, just say next slide.
Okay, first I'd like to say that the media is characterizing it as a conspiracy theory and a kooky conspiracy theory, and that's not going to help exit people at all. It really needs to be described as a psyops, as a mind control program deliberately aimed at converting people into a totalist authoritarian ideology.
Okay, now this bit is just dripping with authoritarian oppression. The very stuff that he accuses cult leaders of doing. So, okay, dude, you're a cult leader. Got it? You are the cult leader. You are the authoritarian that's trying to impose your mind control on others that you don't like, and you say it's undue influence. And you're going to try and put your undue influence on these people, and you're going to try and change the law to oppress these people. So who's the cult leader, dude? Who's the cult leader?
Now, this slide comes from my first book in 1988, Combating Cult Mind Control. But I was able to take all of the models from Chinese communist brainwashing research and kind of put them together under these four elements: behavior control variables, information control variables, thought control variables, and emotional control variables. And in fact, the quantitative study that I'm doing for my dissertation studied over 1,000 people, and we came up with a construct called the BITE model of authoritarian control. Because when you go through all of these elements, it winds up being authoritarian control. And I'm hoping this will be a tool that can be used in courts of law to help illuminate what's the difference between ethical influence and unethical influence.
Okay, hopefully the irony is not escaping you here. He's just given a little rant about authoritarian mind control, and he's going to implement his little BITE program. Where did he get it? From China?
And this is the other important graphic that's in my work and my website, Freedom of Mind. People need to realize influence really is very different depending on its intention and its practice. So if we look on the left side, the constructive healthy, we need to think about informed consent, that each individual is respected and it has a choice to choose to be involved or choose not to be involved.
Right, so then we just put a EULA in front of the ARG, and we also basically have a long terms of agreement that is way too long to read, it has way too much fine print, but just like a bank, we can claim in court that no, you gave your consent. Okay?
It's love-oriented, compassion, rule of law, I would add. Free will, critical thinking, where the authoritarian, I want to say that the DSM-5 of the American Psychiatric Association has a category, 300.15, on dissociative disorder that explicitly names brainwashing and coercive persuasion and thought reform and such. And I experienced this. I had a false identity as a member of the Moonies that suppressed my authentic self. It didn't erase it.
Now here he exposes himself as what he really is, and that's an egotistical cult dropout. He was a cult failure. I don't know about Reverend Moon and his motives, but what's supposed to happen in a cult is your ego gets destroyed so that you are an enlightened being. You can move on from there and kind of graduate. Now clearly he didn't graduate. He basically had his little ego put under threat, and he ran away from the cult and restored his ego. And now what he's doing is he's made a career out of running around protecting his little ego. If the cult was successful, it would have destroyed that ego, it would have enlightened him, and he could run around freeing people. But now he's not. He's a failure, and he's running around oppressing people and reintroducing people back into other cults. This man should not be let loose.
And here's another criticism I have of many media and pundits who say, oh, those people who are Trumpers, no one's ever going to convince them. They're stuck forever. It's like, no, but they just don't understand what they're dealing with. And bring somebody back in time before they ever heard of Trump and wreak access to who they were before and educate them about the bite model and mind control.
Right. Reprogram, brainwash them?
And walk them through respectful questioning from family and friends who care about them, who say, I care about you, you're an intelligent person. If QAnon is real, convert me, convince me. But I need evidence. Show me the proof.
Well, there's an interesting afternoon right there. But before this guy indoctrinates me back into the mainstream cult, which I consider myself liberated from, I want the burden of proof on him. Prove to me that basically what you see in this mainstream cult is actually worth dying for. Because I think that's where him and all his buddies in the mainstream cult are headed for.
And through this dialogue, people can be activated to start getting the wheels turning. And that's what helped me to wake up. The realization that I couldn't trust Moon. He was a liar.
Yeah, maybe Moon was a liar, but how would he know? He didn't finish the course. He dropped out. He is absolutely correct that he never was enlightened. Most cults would actually bring you to enlightenment, and then you can actually pass judgment on them. But you wouldn't, because then you're liberated, like he isn't.
And if he was a liar, I couldn't trust him.
But why would you need to trust him? Your whole website is called Freedom of Mind. Do you have a free mind, or do you need to actually trust these goons?
And if he was a liar, how could he be a man of God? Because we, the Moonies, teach that God is a God of truth. So just kind of like bringing back the critical thinking ability is definitely doable. But honestly, it's family and friends who care that are going to be in the best position to help people exit.
Sure, family and friends then can be abused and used to draw somebody back out of a cult. But here's the question of ethics. If the family and friends actually does love this person in the cult, then surely they want them to be free. Surely they should respect their decisions. And here clearly they don't. Do they really love this person? I doubt it. Otherwise they would actually allow them free choice, even if that choice is to be in a cult.
And I'm in touch with a number of my friends who are former cult members, and we're starting a meme movement in the spirit of Me Too. It's called I Got Out.
Yeah, hashtag I Got Out.
I got out.
But remember, this is not brainwashing.
So the idea is if millions of people start talking openly without stigma, hey, it happened to me, I got taken by a multi-level marketing group, or I got controlled by a controlling girlfriend, or controlling
Nexium, or QAnon.
Or I got into the military-industrial complex, or I actually was in the army, or I went to university. Basically, I got out.
Or whatever it might be.
Exactly. If people start this conversation, if people are looking at different documentaries about different cults and can start connecting the dots.
Yeah, I agree. That's fantastic. But why stop there? Why not educate the 320 million Americans about their indoctrination?
And that's another critical point I want to comment on, Dave, is that when one is in one of these groups, the last thing that will help is attacking the leader, the doctrine, or the group, because it snaps up the cult identity, thought stopping starts happening. The most effective thing with QAnon and with Trump believers is talking about Chinese communist brainwashing or traffickers and how they do Like right now, there are 1 million to 2 million Uyghurs who are being brainwashed in China. What does that mean? Behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. Like, get into the specifics and educate them about these other groups. And then you have a platform to begin to have them to reality test what actually are they believing and how far would they go?
How far would they go? Planetary destruction, dude, and beyond.
Like, I've talked to cult members and said, so if you were told to drink cyanide-laced Flavor Aid, like Jim Jones asked 900 of his followers to do, would you do it? Oh, no, I wouldn't. Okay. If you were asked to take your assault rifle and go out on the streets and kill Americans, would you do it? You know, pause.
Yeah, and if America asked you to get an assault weapon and to run at Germans or Japanese or Chinese, would you do it? Oh, please. Of course you would.
Huh? These are Americans. Why would you think about hurting fellow Americans? Where did that come from?
Yeah, just stick to killer drones and killing Arabs, dude.
Let's go back in time before you started adopting these crazy beliefs and unpack them.
Right, let's do that. Starting with, why did you ever start supporting this suicide cult that you're in? And I'm talking about the United States of America. Global industrial civilization is a suicide cult. Let's reel this back and get back into how did you get into it? How do you get out of it? He's on the right track, but why victimize all these people that's trying to deprogram Americans? What's better about the American cult? It's also a death cult.
Because they are unpackable.
And I want to just point out briefly, you know, just based on my own experience working in the field of social network analysis and, you know, understanding how networks of people work, you know, this is fundamentally a social problem.
No, it's a psychological problem, and he needs to sort out his psychology.
And the challenge that we have with this kind of disinformation that tends to rewire people's social networks, and the way that they do that is they, you know, once people are taken onto the on-ramp of believing you know, new sets of beliefs, they end up severing ties with people who, you know, disagree with them about that. And we all see examples of that on our, you know, Facebook and social media feeds about, I'm unfriending so-and-so because they're talking smack and, you know, I don't want to be around that anymore. And that's how this stuff does its damage, is it reconfigures our social networks. So the way to undo that damage, the way to reverse that damage is to actually put the social constructs back together.
So let's get the radical left and the radical right and unite them and overthrow these authoritarian states.
And it turns out that, you know, reconfiguring, you know, rejoining social networks, bringing people back from the brink and reconnecting with people that they've lost connection with is way harder than going in the other direction. At least, you know, that's my experience. And,
it is. But people deep down inside don't want to be lied to, don't want to be exploited or abused.
And they ultimately don't want to be isolated into networks.
Yeah, they miss
really
their family and friends. Right. They, you know, really, seriously, love is stronger than mind control.
I certainly do miss my family and friends. That's why I hated being locked up in a cubicle and forced to work in an office.
Yep.
And honestly, there is hope, but we need to educate the planet about this graph and how to discern and unpack and then scale interventions that will help people to start reality testing.
Right. And, you know, the kind of counseling that you've been doing for decades has been around getting individuals to kind of come out of this cultish configuration back into something that's healthier.
Whoa! Like the mainstream culture? That's healthy? Dude, look in the fucking mirror.
We need to figure out how to scale that up to, you know, work with tens of millions of people.
And of course we'll do it with their informed consent, right? Right? Whoa, the double standards, dude. Whoa!
And that's its own challenge with its own ethical issues that come with it. Just in the time we have left, I wanted to have you take us through this just a little bit. This is a bite model evaluation of QAnon that you had posted on your blog.
Yeah, I've been yelled at to never put more than 5 lines on a slide.
Well, also for us that are colorblind, red-green colorblind.
Yeah, and for colorblind people, forgive me, but really, freedomofmind.com, learn about undue influence. You can, go through this individually, but essentially my doctoral research was based on operationalizing each one of these factors and having people say never to always on a 6-point scale. And that's how we came up with the bite model of authoritarian control. So, the bottom line with behavior control is instilling dependence and obedience.
Like a state, bro, like a state.
Right.
Discouraging individualism and encouraging groupthink, rigid rules and regulations, etc.
Bingo!
Information control, I already mentioned that legitimate groups will tell you up front who they are. Mind control groups never do, and QAnon is a perfect example of deception.
Another perfect example is Amazon, Google, Facebook, Twitter.
And what we have now in this world is a mind control device that if you sign up for certain notifications and certain websites, etc., you're going to be constantly reinforced into that mindset. It's absolutely critical to talk to former members and talk to critics and say, what do you got? Let me hear why you're critical of QAnon, and actually stop and listen.
If you do that, I'll guarantee exactly what you'll find. You'll find people like Stephen here who dropped out of the cult because the cult started to break up his ego. So you will get people that gripe about how their ego was stepped on, not realizing that that's the whole point, not only to step on your ego, but to crush and eliminate it.
Thought control is black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil, rejecting any other ideology. Like if you're in QAnon and you are concerned about trafficking, help organizations that actually are helping people who are victims of trafficking.
And do the same thing, of course, for people that are kidnapped against their will illegally by cult deprogrammers like Stephen and the boys here.
Right. Yeah. You Googling for stuff and reporting false leads to organizations that are actually working on this is not going to help.
Exactly. And hypnosis I put under thought control, and that's a whole TEDx talk in and of itself. On hypnosis, ethical uses and unethical uses of hypnosis. But what I'm seeing with QAnon recruiters is all unethical.
Right.
The emotional control, they always appeal to make people feel special, like you're the chosen.
You mean like commercial advertisers in consumer culture?
Well, also that there's an out group that needs to be protected against, and that this group, the in group, is under siege from the out group.
Yep, but you're special and you're going to save the world and you're going to help the children, etc. But it really comes down to guilt manipulation and fear manipulation, with the highlight of phobias that if you don't join QAnon movement, then the world's going to hell.
And if you don't join the green movement, the world's going to hell. And if you don't become a vegan, the world's going to go to hell. And if you don't vote Democrat, the world's going to go to hell. And on and on and on. See, everybody's in the same game. We need to destroy this game, not try and move people to the right or ethical side of the game. There is no right or ethical side in this game. It's all just cults against cults. And we need a cult to actually elevate people out of this cultish behavior. This guy is part and parcel of the problem.
Right.
Exactly. There's no hope for the future.
Now, one thing I thought maybe you could briefly address is, one criticism of people that criticize QAnon is, they say, well, how could you criticize a movement that encourages people to think for themselves and to do independent research? Surely that's the sort of free will and rational thinking that you would encourage, right? And I think, the short answer to that might be that you've seen this before.
Well, Scientology says that very thing. Do the research. Don't believe anything that you can't validate with your own experience.
Don't believe us. Go read the books yourself.
But
and these guys are saying like, don't do the research, dudes. Don't think for yourself. I mean, come on.
It's just wordplay. Real research involves not just listening to your recruiters and the information silo you're in. Learn about brainwashing and mind control and other cults.
For heaven's sake, don't listen to what the cult's actually saying. Listen to what I have to say about cults.
Talk to critics and former members. I've done a ton of blogs on QAnon, other cults.
Right.
Understand this is not mystical. The mind is, as going back to the beginning of our talk, and Jim talking about how the brain wants to find meaning in meaningless things. That's its function.
What?
We filter things to have an organized reality, and we're on one planet, everybody. Our survival depends on each other.
Right. We can't have people going off into the deep end and not becoming useful to society.
And there's the essence of it. None of these guys really cares about you or me or wants us to be free or have freedom of thought. It's all a lie. They just want us to be a resource for the industrial machine just like them. The American capitalist credo is production, production, and more production. The greatest sin in the land of the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free is not to be productive or not to pay your debts. What's really threatening about breakaway cults to establishment shills like these is that they really amount to bands of free-thinking runaway slaves and pose a huge threat to the dominant cult shill.
Industrial Revolution took off right around here, eastern Massachusetts, mid-19th century. This was a period when independent farmers were being driven into the industrial system, men and women, incidentally, women from the farms, so-called factory girls, and they bitterly resented it. The people driven into the industrial system regarded it as an attack on their personal dignity, on their rights as human beings. They were free human beings who were being forced into what they called wage slavery, which they regarded as not very different from chattel slavery. In fact, this was such a popular view that it was actually a slogan of the Republican Party, that the only difference between working for a wage and being a slave is that working for a wage is supposedly temporary. And they bitterly resented the fact that the industrial system was even taking away their rich cultural life. And the cultural life was rich. They argued that if you're say a journeyman, a craftsman, and you sell your product, you're selling what you produced. If you're a wage earner, you're selling yourself, which is deeply offensive. They condemned what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self. Sounds familiar. It began in Texas, spread into the Midwest, the enormous movement of farmers who wanted to free themselves from the domination by the northeastern bankers and capitalists, because they ran the markets, sort of forced them to sell their what they produced on credit and squeeze them with credit and so on.
Welcome to Western consumer culture.
Anyone who's fostering hate and fear in order to fraction and turn people against each other is evil.
Like Christianity or Judaism or any other one of the religions that plague us.
It's certainly unhelpful, and unproductive and, evil at worst, for sure.
I'm going with evil.
Yeah, I think in general that's the right answer.
I agree. That's why governments are evil. Why does he support them?
just to wind us up here to get us done.
Very briefly, endingthegame.com. Rachel Thomas was a victim of a trafficker. She was at Emory University, beautiful, intelligent woman, and she created this 10 session program designed to educate sex trafficking victims, survivors rather, to the bite model and the influence continuum, and to understand that the pimp or the trafficker doesn't really love them, because narcissists don't love. They say they love, but they're incapable of the real thing. And helping people get empowered to end the game, which is the term that pimps use for trafficking, end the game and get your life back.
We doctors were wrong in thinking that opioids can't be used long term. They can be, and they should be. They can be, and they should be.
And we began to be very demanding and to doctors that they fix us, and that the tools to fix us were these narcotic painkillers. Doctors began to feel all these pressures, an epidemic of pain. We're not treating pain right. All these sales reps, all these threats of lawsuit, and then patients on top of that. And it slowly, then not so slowly, doctors began to change their minds and began to very, very aggressively prescribe these pills. The first attempts were really to convince doctors that there was a new day dawning, that science now knew that there was no real addictive risk to these pills when they were used to treat pain.
Right. And you had this article that was in the MIT Technology Review that cited some of your work as well.
Yeah, I think that the solution to the problem of undue influence in our day and age is not going to be solved by banning or deplatforming. It'll help slow the recruitment of new people for sure, and there should be stuff done. But what really needs to happen is a much more advanced, robust counter-educational program that preventively educates people how not to get sucked into a mind control cult.
But the people who gave us schooling weren't these wealthy people. They were utopian thinkers who believed the family and tradition were the greatest obstacles to making a perfect society, a utopia. And every utopia that survived invents schooling long before we had universal force schooling. There were always little neighborhood schools, and they all invent universal schooling of a homogeneous variety in order to reach utopia.
Like QAnon, which I call a mind control cult,
is set up to produce a predictable, homogeneous, safe product. They're set up to sort people into occupational categories, roughly consonant with what the current economy demands.
And to empower people to be good citizens, which includes going out and vote.
Go out and vote for what? Go out and vote for Stephen's cult, of course.
Right, absolutely. And so I think that's going to just about wrap us up. I apologize that we're not able to get to questions and answers today.
This is a precious thing that Americans have that a lot of other countries don't have.
Yeah, America is a cult that has a lot of precious things, like freedom of thought. And that's why we have to cancel and oppress these people. That's why we have to bring them back. That's why we have to deprogram them and program them into the culture of freedom. Our cult, not their cult, our cult.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I just want to go ahead and bring the program to a close. I want to thank each of our guests, but I also wanted to just have a couple of closing remarks, for reporters and other kinds of media that might be looking into this, set of, networks and whatnot. This is incredibly difficult work to report on because everybody that is involved in it is lying in some capacity.
Fake news?
There's disinformation on top of
not you and not me and not
no, not the four of us. No, the four of us are telling the truth. Trust us. But
brief flash of self-awareness there, but so brief.
That's on it. If anything, I mean, I made a mistake. I said 27,000 years old for Ramtha, and it was 35,000.
Yeah, that's an easy one. I
was
frequently make that
missing
mistake.
the different cult.
That's a whole 8,000 years.
Yeah.
But, point being that this is really difficult work to report on. We're aware of that. We know that reporters have a lot of competing priorities. And, this is some of the most difficult work to report on. But there is kind of an ethical way to report on this, and it involves recognizing the undue influence aspects of this and getting that right.
So the ethical way of reporting on this is reporting it our way and not their way. Okay?
And not being sloppy about it, I think, is really, really key. And all of us that are certainly on this call, but all of us that are working on, this research, with us, are very committed to ethical responses to this, and would be very happy to interface with any media and other outlets that might be looking to, explore this terrain.
Except us when we asked to do it.
Recognizing its difficulty. So we also included here contact information for each of the four of us, and any of us would be happy to hear from you about additional information that you may have regarding these networks and this set of processes. This is an ongoing situation. It is not going to be resolved, overnight, but we do think that there's a lot of progress being made on kind of unearthing exactly kind of what's going on here and why. And just a reminder that if you do want to get trusted, verified information about what's going on with child sexual abuse and trafficking, or to donate to help address that problem, please visit polarisproject.org, one of the better organizations working in that field.
Just don't expect them to tackle child abuse like this anytime soon.
The ancient ritual of circumcision is performed. But in some ultra-Orthodox communities, religious leaders, known as moyals, also engage in something controversial during the bris. The moyal actually uses his mouth to suck the blood from the infant's penis after he cuts off the foreskin.
It sometimes results in the transmission of communicable diseases, sometimes even leading to brain damage and possibly death. There are now 2 more Jewish infants here in New York City that received not only a circumcision from a moil, but also a case of full-blown herpes. According to the New York Department of Health, in July of 2014, this month, the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene received reports of 2 new cases of herpes simplex virus infection in newborn male infants following direct orogenital suction.
So,
and if you're a former Q member, believer, please speak out, because we need to create a movement.
Right. This, hashtag I got out. For people that, decided that the Q movement was not all it was cracked up to be, please go ahead and start to seed that. And let's get an ethical conversation going about how to get people, sort of back to normal after being involved with
not
this
just
stuff.
Q though. If you've been in
any kind of destructive movement, absolutely.
Any kind of destructive movement, I got out.
Any kind of destructive movement, even mainstream Western industrial culture. Let's stop this madness, shall we? Let's stop it.
Including the cult of Trump.
Oh, the mask comes off. It's just politics. Just political manipulation. This whole video has just been left-wing political manipulation against the right-wing. Let's stop this nonsense, guys. Let's stop.
Well, again, Steve, this isn't about left or right. It's about all of the groups that, are using these tactics. So, again, I want to thank our audience for being here today. We had a very large number of people turn out. We really appreciate that. We will be posting this video on YouTube and on our website for people to check out and to share with others. We, again, think that this is an incredibly important conversation, and we hope that you will share this with others. We will be continuing to have some conversations on this set of topics here at TEDx Mid-Atlantic, and we look forward to seeing you again. And thank you again to each of our guests, Steve, Desiree, and Jim.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you so
much work. Thank you so much.
Thank you for helping make it happen. It wouldn't have been possible without each of you. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Okay, you get the general idea. So let's take this information, use it as a how-to manual. Let's learn how to do PsyOps the way QAnon did it. And let's take these institutional structures down before they kill us all. And thanks for listening to this message. I hope you understood it. I hope you understood the double standards. And I hope you understood the insanity of our world. It's cults, cults, cults. And cults trying to get you out of cults when they're really just another cult. We need to get out of this insanity. Way to do it is, if you can't join them, beat them. Create a cult and let's free ourselves.